Night, in the ancient imagination, was not an absence of light. It was a landscape, one you entered whether you wanted to or not. The sun might have governed daytime, but the night had no ruler, no laws, and definitely no customer service department. People stepped across its threshold like travellers crossing into enemy territory. Once the world dimmed, you weren't still in your house. You were officially in the night, the same way you'd be in a forest, a cave, or a suspiciously quiet alley. Darkness had agency, personality, and ambition. It covered the land not gently, but deliberately, like a cat claiming a table you definitely told it not to get on. Before we step into a time when nightmares were blamed on spirits, demons, and unseen forces, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether it's day or night where you are right now. Now let's begin. And because night was viewed as a place, not a moment on a clock, it had geography. Different parts of the home, the village, and the countryside were believed to transform into new nighttime zones. The doorway, for example, was no longer an inanimate frame. It became a border crossing, which is why so many cultures put charms, bells, herbs, holy symbols, or aggressively judgmental household gods around them. People weren't decorating, they were fortifying. A modern equivalent would be installing 5 security systems, because you're convinced that after sunset, your living room relocates to another dimension. The edges of fields, forests, and rivers became hotspots where the night place touched the human world most directly. Thresholds were sites of supernatural traffic. You didn't just worry about wolves or thieves lurking in the dark. You worried about the night itself bending at the edges, letting something seep through. Not necessarily evil, just uninvited. Nighttime wasn't moral, it was simply uninterested in your comfort. Think of it as the universe's sleep mode. Most features turned off, some bugs emerged, and absolutely no guarantees were provided. Inside the home, darkness reshaped the logic of every room. A kitchen in daylight was where meals were prepared, but at night, the same space became unpredictable, a place where embers whispered, shadows moved strangely, and the silence itself sounded too alive. Bedrooms weren't safe havens either. Once candles were snuffed, you effectively checked into a new location, a place where you could see less, hear more, and imagine absolutely everything. A strange creak in daylight meant the wood was settling. At night, the same sound meant something else was settling, possibly on you. Human senses didn't help. Eyes were useless, ears were over-enthusiastic, touch became dramatic, and imagination inflated like bread dough left in the sun. People didn't believe they were exaggerating. They believed their senses were responding to the altered terrain. And honestly, fair enough. When a single gust of wind can turn your entire family into statues of pure fear, it's hard to pretend you're still located in the same world you were during the afternoon. Night travel was its own adventure. Leaving the house after dark felt like stepping off the map, literally. Medieval and early modern maps often ignored the concept of nighttime landscapes entirely. But stories filled the gap. Roads changed direction after sunset. Forests expanded. Paths that were safe at noon became the personal playgrounds of things you did not want to name out loud. It wasn't that people lacked knowledge of the terrain. They believed the terrain itself changed personality. You didn't just get lost at night. The night got creative. And this wasn't limited to Europe. In multiple cultures, night was treated as an alternate version of the world that only revealed its true self in the dark. In parts of the Middle East, night had its own creatures, beings who existed entirely in the hours after sunset, slipping between shadows with the ease of navigating city streets. In parts of Africa, night was said to lift a veil from the land, revealing a hidden layer of reality humans weren't meant to look at without preparation. In East Asia, night was a time when boundaries between living and non-living blurred. You weren't walking through the same courtyard you saw at noon. You were walking through its nighttime counterpart, a parallel zone with different residents. The truly unnerving part was that night didn't behave consistently. It didn't promise to be the same every evening. One night could feel calm and uneventful, and the very next could feel charged, heavy, or watchful. People didn't describe the night as predictable. They described it as moody. If daytime was the responsible adult of the universe, night was the sibling who took the keys without asking. Every culture built rituals around this transition. Doors were shut at specific times. Lamps were lit in specific ways. Sounds were explained quickly and loudly, mostly to convince yourself the explanation was true. Families gathered closer, voices lowered, and activities slowed. Humans weren't winding down. They were adapting to a new environment, and when nightmares happened, they were not interpreted as internal problems. Not yet. They were seen as interactions with this nighttime landscape. You weren't having a dream. You were encountering something in the place you had entered. Something that didn't need your permission. Something that lived in the hours where the world's rules went on break. Night didn't fall. It arrived, and it brought a whole world with it. Long before psychologists wandered onto the scene with clipboards and comforting nouns, people understood dreams as external events, not internal productions. To them, dreams weren't something your mind created. They were something that happened to you. You went to sleep the same way you might go fishing. Whatever ended up in your net was not guaranteed, not controllable, and definitely not your fault. If anything strange, alarming, or embarrassing appeared in your dreams, well, something had stopped by. This worldview came naturally because for most of history, humans weren't especially attached to the idea of the brain having ideas. The brain, in many ancient medical traditions, was considered glorified stuffing. Egyptian embalmers famously scooped it out because they saw no reason to preserve such a useless organ. Minds weren't believed to live in the head. They were in the chest, the belly, the breath, or the soul. Depending on the culture, your consciousness floated somewhere between your ribs and the local shrine. So the idea that dreams emerge from a biological process was about as convincing as blaming thunderstorms on cabbage. Instead, dreams arrived the way unexpected guests did. Silently, unpredictably, and usually without sending a polite message beforehand. They entered your sleep the way travelers pass through a village. They came from somewhere, even if you didn't know the route. This idea created a powerful psychological landscape. Every dream was a visitation, a communication, or at the very least, a guest appearance. In ancient Mesopotamia, dreams were so externalized that they were treated as courier services from the gods. The gods themselves rarely appeared. They had messengers, interns, and lesser assistants who delivered nighttime content. Dream omens were listed in massive clay tablet manuals with thousands of entries. These weren't interpretation guides. They were directories of external events, as if the gods had invented a very early, very stressful version of email. You weren't the author of your dream. You were the recipient of divine correspondence. If the content was alarming, well, you had been CC'd for a reason. Egyptians took the idea even further. They believed dreams were places the soul physically travelled to. The body slept, but the spirit wandered through landscapes real enough to affect its health. Dreaming wasn't imagined, it was motion. And this meant if you had a frightening dream, the logical explanation wasn't stress. It was that your soul had walked into a neighbourhood it really shouldn't have. You could return shaken, confused, or slightly crispy around the edges depending on the journey. In other words, bad dreams weren't internal anxieties, they were unfortunate vacation choices. In ancient Greece, dreams belonged to the domain of Oneiroi, the gods of dream delivery. They emerged from a special gate, either of horn or ivory, depending on the truthfulness of the message. These weren't metaphorical gates. Greeks believed the world actually contained cosmological doorways where dream beings slipped through before tiptoeing into human bedrooms. The moment you fell asleep, your mind wasn't generating imagery, it was hosting visitors. If anything, you were the set piece. The dream simply used you as scenery. Meanwhile, in many indigenous cultures, dreams were interactions with spirits who lived parallel to the waking world. These were not illusions. They were conversations. Vision quests weren't internal meditation. They were deliberate invitations for the dream world to send representatives. The idea that dreams could be personal hallucinations would have felt strangely lonely, like saying messages in your mailbox were written by your furniture. Across Asia, ancestors were believed to drop into your dreams when they needed something. These weren't symbolic appearances, they were actual visits, often involving requests, warnings, or opinions about how poorly you were managing things. A nightmare involving a displeased grandparent wasn't a psychological expression of guilt, it was a performance review. Because dreams were visitors, people developed dream etiquette. You greeted the dream in the morning through ritual. You protected yourself before sleep with charms. You avoided certain foods that invited unwanted dream guests. You washed your face before sunrise to remove lingering dream presence. If you had a disturbing dream, you didn't self-reflect. You performed damage control. Something had visited you, and now you had to respond properly to avoid offense. Dreams didn't reflect the self. They reflected relationships with forces beyond you. This worldview also meant dreams weren't about you. Today, modern psychology tells people their dreams express subconscious fears, desires, and conflicts. But for thousands of years, dreams were about whatever external beings wanted to show you. If you had a nightmare, it didn't reveal your anxieties. It revealed someone else's schedule. This produced one of history's most unintentionally comforting ideas. No dream was your responsibility. You didn't need to understand it. You didn't need to justify it. You definitely didn't need to journal about it. Something visited you, delivered a message or a chaotic performance, and left. If it was confusing, that was normal. If it didn't make sense, that was expected. Dreams weren't supposed to be coherent. The visitors rarely rehearsed. To ancient people, the worst insult wasn't, "You dreamed badly," but "You ignored the dream." Not because you ignored your psyche, because you ignored someone who went out of their way to drop in. So when nightmares came, the question wasn't, "What is my mind saying?" It was, "Who showed up uninvited, and what do they want now?" For most of European history, if you woke up gasping, unable to move, heart pounding so hard it sounded like it was trying to escape, you didn't think, classic rematonia. You thought, something is sitting on me, and not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, a creature on your chest, using you as seating. Welcome to one of the most widespread, persistent, and artistically celebrated explanations for nightmares. The chest-sitting entity, a creature known by dozens of names but united by one purpose, making sure you did not enjoy your night. This belief was everywhere in Europe, from Icelandic sagas to Italian folk tales. The idea was so universal that the English word nightmare itself comes from this being. The mare, an oppressive spirit, not a horse. No galloping required, just sitting. Bad dreams weren't emotions, they were ergonomic choices made by supernatural squatters. A nightmare was an event, not a feeling. Imagine trying to explain to your medieval family that you woke in terror because of internal stress. Stress from what? You didn't have taxes, you had tithes, you didn't have email, you had letters that took 6 months, and you didn't have deadlines, you had grain that might kill you. But you didn't talk about stress. If something crushed your breath, it wasn't anxiety. It was a creature with questionable boundaries. When people woke unable to move, a classic symptom of sleep paralysis, they assumed the immobilization was caused by weight, something pressing down, something with form, something that apparently had nowhere better to sit. Nightmares weren't mental disturbances, they were nighttime visitors with terrible manners. Names for the chest-sitter. This creature appeared across cultures like an unwanted pan-European collaboration. Nachtmar, Germanic regions, a malicious creature that rides or sits on sleepers. Mara, Scandinavia, sometimes a restless spirit, sometimes a witch, always a chest enthusiast. Cauchemar, French, from cauchemar to press, literally the pressing nightmare. Pesanta, Catalonia, often shaped like a dog or cat made of shadow and iron, specializing in ribcage compression. Alp, German folklore, a capricious creature known to wear hats and cause nightmares, because even your tormentor needed accessories. What united them wasn't their species, shape, or origin. It was their job description. Sit on humans while they sleep and ruin their night. If you felt something heavy, if you couldn't breathe, if you sensed a presence you couldn't see, congratulations, you'd been sat on. The mechanics of medieval chess-sitting people didn't picture this lightly. In their minds, the creature perched like a determined toddler determined to wake its parent. Except this toddler wasn't small, friendly, or bound by polite society. These entities came out at night, found a sleeper, climbed onto their chest, and stayed there, crushing breath and preventing movement. Not because they wanted to kill you. Most believed they wanted to feed off your breath, fear, or life force. You were a snack, not a target. It's worth noting, this was one of the few supernatural explanations that didn't blame the victim. If the nightmare came, it wasn't because you sinned, questioned authority, or forgot to say a prayer. It was because something with legs, hooves, or no visible anatomy at all decided you looked like a perfectly acceptable chair. The sensation became the story. Medieval people were nothing if not observant. They noticed. You wake up and cannot move. Your chest feels compressed. You feel watched. Your breathing is shallow and forced. Panic surges through your body like a warning you can't act on. Today we call that sleep paralysis, but without neurology, the obvious explanation was a creature exerting pressure. If you can't move your limbs, clearly something is pinning them down. If you can't scream, clearly something is muffling you. If you wake feeling crushed, clearly something is sitting on your lungs like they owe rent. People describe the sensation vividly. It sat on me. It pressed the breath out of me. It climbed onto my ribs. It weighed like a stone. No one said, I had a thought. Thoughts don't weigh anything. Nightmares, however, apparently had mass, the iconic art that immortalized the chess-sitter. If you want proof of how seriously people took this creature, look at Henry Fuseli's 1781 painting The Nightmare. It shows a woman sprawled across a bed, a demonic little figure perched proudly on her chest, and, because subtlety is for daylight hours, a ghostly horse head emerging from the shadows. The painting wasn't shocking because it invented the idea. It was shocking because it perfectly illustrated something countless people already believed. When people viewed the painting, they didn't say, "How imaginative." They said, "Yes, that's what it looks like." How people protected themselves. If nightmares were caused by supernatural buttocks applying pressure, you obviously needed preventative measures. Turn shoes upside down so the creature won't climb into them first. Sleep with iron tools nearby, since iron repelled many beings. Cross your arms or legs to prevent the creature from settling properly. Wear nightcaps infused with protective herbs. Sleep facing different directions just in case creatures had preferred seating arrangements. Medieval nighttime safety essentially boiled down to making yourself the least comfortable chair imaginable. Nightmares as physical assault. Because nightmares were believed to be real, physical events, people recounted them as experiences, not dreams. Something arrived, sat, stayed far longer than polite, and left. You didn't interpret the nightmare as symbolism or emotion. You described it the way you describe someone breaking into your house, sitting on your sofa and falling asleep on top of you. The creature did the nightmare. You merely received it. You weren't stressed. You were furniture. Long before neuroscience explained that your body temporarily paralyzes itself so you don't act out your dreams, a thoughtful but poorly communicated feature, people woke up trapped in their own skin and immediately assumed the universe was doing something personal. Sleep paralysis, in historical understanding, was not a biological glitch. It was an assault, a visit, or a warning, depending on who you asked. And absolutely nothing about it was accidental. What we now know as a perfectly natural part of REM sleep felt, to earlier generations, like waking up in the middle of a haunting. Imagine opening your eyes, seeing your room clearly, hearing everything around you, yet being unable to move even a fingertip. The sensation wasn't framed as muscular atonia. It was framed as, oh no, something has found me. To the pre-scientific mind, immobility required a cause. Nothing happened without intention. If your limbs refused to respond, someone, or something, must have disabled them. Sleep paralysis became the perfect breeding ground for fear because the entire experience felt engineered. You felt manipulated, not malfunctioning. A body that betrayed you. People trusted their bodies the way you trust a door to open when you turn the handle. When the handle doesn't move, you assume something is blocking the door, not that the door temporarily forgot how to be a door. Historical sleepers interpreted paralysis with similar logic. The body did not simply misfire. Bodies at night existed within a larger network of forces, spiritual, supernatural, or environmental. When the body failed, the conclusion wasn't my physiology malfunctioned. It was, a being is pressing on me. My spirit is being held down. Something is preventing me from waking fully. A force has frozen my body but left my awareness intact. This last detail was particularly terrifying. If you were awake enough to feel everything, but too paralyzed to do anything, you quickly concluded that someone wanted you conscious while helpless. That thought alone could power entire centuries of folklore. The mind fills the silence. Sleep paralysis also arrived with sensory glitches, shadows moving, voices at the edge of hearing, pressure on the chest, weight on the limbs, and an overwhelming sense of presence. These sensations weren't subtle, they were dramatic, intrusive, and impossible to ignore. Without the vocabulary of sleep stages or neurochemistry, people interpreted these experiences literally. If you saw something, it was there. If you felt watched, you were being watched. If you felt touched, something had touched you. If you sensed a presence, congratulations, you had company. Nighttime logic didn't offer psychological metaphors, it offered intruders. Supernatural explanations emerged instantly. In different regions, different beings were blamed, but the pattern was universal. Sleep paralysis meant an external force was acting upon the sleeper. In many European households, the obvious culprit was a malicious nocturnal being sitting on the chest or holding the body down. In Scandinavian tradition, the Mara didn't just sit, it pinned, pressed, or tangled the sleeper in invisible binds. In parts of Eastern Europe, paralysis was associated with wandering spirits or witches immobilizing victims to weaken their life force. In some parts of the Middle East, jinn were believed to restrain sleepers physically, sometimes as punishment for disrespecting holy spaces or moral duties. And crucially, these weren't metaphorical foes. People didn't say, "It felt like something was holding me down." They said, "It held me down." The difference is everything. Helplessness was the horror. Modern sleep paralysis is uncomfortable, frightening, and confusing, but ancient sleep paralysis was existentially terrorizing. You weren't dealing with misfiring neurons. You were dealing with an enemy who had bypassed your defenses. The sense of being immobilized while awake created a narrative of intentional capture. People believed their breath was being stolen, their spirit was being pressed out of their body, their soul was temporarily disconnected. A demon or spirit was riding them. The feeling of suffocation, now known to result from shallow, inconsistent breathing during REM, felt like a creature actively squeezing humanity out of you. Many historical accounts describe sensations of being locked, bound, or chained, not metaphorically, but as literal restraints applied by invisible hands. Imagine waking up with your muscles offline and your imagination fully online. That's how folklore happens. The fear was physical. Every culture that experienced sleep paralysis created rituals to prevent it. People didn't wait for explanations. They created defenses, charms pinned to shirts, knives slipped under pillows, prayers repeated before bed, doors barred with specific symbols, herbs burned to cleanse the sleeping space, beds moved to face different directions. The idea was simple. If something supernatural could immobilize you, you needed supernatural solutions, not introspection. Magical protection wasn't superstition, it was strategy. The soul misalignment theory. A particularly vivid historical explanation was the idea that the body woke up before the soul returned. Sleep was seen as a spiritual journey, dreams were places the soul visited. So if you woke up paralyzed, the conclusion was obvious. Your soul wasn't fully back yet. Your consciousness returned, but the driver was still finding its way home. Some cultures believed the soul had difficulty re-entering the body at the correct angle, like a person trying to insert a key upside down in a lock. Others believed spirits interfered with its return, delaying the process deliberately. Thus paralysis wasn't just physical, it was cosmological. Your soul was temporarily misplaced. The body rebooted. The soul forgot the password. A terror that felt designed. Sleep paralysis may be universal, but its pre-scientific interpretations were specific, vivid, and deeply personal. People weren't simply frightened. They felt targeted. They felt chosen. They felt invaded. And when something terrifying invades, the logical conclusion in a world without neuroscience is not that your brain glitched, but that something in the dark came for you. In the world before psychology, if something frightening happened, it wasn't because your neurons misfired or your subconscious got creative. Fear had a source, and that source often had horns, a long resume, and an extremely predictable work schedule. Demons in many societies didn't roam freely all day like unregulated hazards. They had shifts, patterns, and preferred hours, nighttime hours specifically. You could almost imagine them punching in with clawed hands at sunset, ready for another night of tormenting whoever went to sleep unguarded. Daytime was, inconveniently for them, too public, too bright, too watched. Humans could see danger coming during the day. Demons, according to popular belief, needed darkness because darkness was cooperation. It muffled sound, erased witnesses, and blurred boundaries. It also made humans slower, sleepier, and frankly, too tired to put up much of a fight. Demons were not inefficient. They simply recognized ideal working conditions. Night was a demonic business environment. Ancient and medieval people saw the cosmos as having rules, not scientific ones, but cosmic ones. Good forces had hours when they dominated, and evil forces had hours when they thrived. You can think of the universe as an elaborate celestial office building, where departments took turns using the same conference room. Daylight belonged to gods, saints, angels, reason, and public activity. Nighttime belonged to everything that preferred not being seen. In folklore, demons often didn't bother anyone at noon. Noon was for respectable activities like farming, trading, and pretending your neighbour wasn't stealing from you. But once dusk settled, demons acquired, not power, exactly, but opportunity. Humans became passive targets, exhausted, unconscious, unguarded, and partially unplugged from the world. Night wasn't just a backdrop, it was a shift change. Demons had specialties. Just like any workforce, demons weren't all doing the same job. They had divisions. Dream demons sent nightmares, illusions, or emotional torments. Breath thieves interfered with breathing, resulting in choking dreams. Troublers whispered lies or fears into the half-conscious mind. Mind riders used sleeping bodies as vessels for mischief or travel. Heart disturbers stirred anxiety, dread, or overwhelming sadness. Illusion spinners created dreamscapes filled with horrors or temptations. In some traditions, dream demons worked with the precision of bureaucrats. They delivered nightmares as if assigned by cosmic supervisors. You didn't necessarily get a demon because you sinned. You got one because it was scheduled to appear in your region that week. Evil, surprisingly, followed a reliable rotation. The demonic commute demons in folklore rarely just appeared. They travelled, with intention, with direction, and sometimes with flair. Some arrived on the wind, others slipped through cracks, keyholes, or shadows. Windows and doors were considered the equivalent of unsecured borders. But the most vulnerable entry point was often believed to be the sleeper themselves. When a person drifted into unconsciousness, the soul relaxed its defences. The mind opened like an unguarded window. Demons didn't break in. They walked in. And if you woke from a nightmare at just the wrong moment, people believed you might catch the demon leaving, like a raccoon startled at a trash can. Humans had nightly weak points. Why were demons such overachievers at night? Because humans hit their vulnerability peak. Vision dropped to almost nothing. Reaction time slowed. Body lay still. Mind drifted. Judgment softened. Physical senses misinterpreted shadows and sounds. Social protection disappeared. Everyone was asleep. In other words, humans became soft targets. Demons weren't masterminds. They just knew good timing. Ancient and medieval logic concluded, if evil can strike at noon, it will. But if it can strike at midnight, it must. Night was simply more efficient. Nightmares as demonic deliverables. Nightmares weren't random mental movies. They were hand-delivered emotional packages, crafted to destabilize you. Cultures across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East believed demons used dreams as communication tools, sometimes to torment, sometimes to deceive, sometimes to lure. A nightmare wasn't an internal crisis, it was a message. A terrifying chase dream meant a demon wanted your fear. A dream of falling meant a demon was tugging at your soul. A nightmare of sorrow meant something was trying to weaken your spirit. A dream of temptation meant a demon was checking whether you were flammable. Nightmares were understood not as mistakes of the brain, but as intentional disturbances, planned and dispatched by a nocturnal workforce with alarming punctuality, preventing night shift visitors. Because demons had hours, humans did too. Entire nightly rituals emerged to prevent demonic visits. Bedtime prayers were not optional, they were spiritual lock-ins. Candles were left burning to give demons fewer shadows to hide in. Iron objects were placed nearby because evil hated metallurgy. Salt was sprinkled near beds as a spiritual do not enter sign. Amulets were worn during sleep like nighttime armor. Beds faced specific directions to disrupt demonic approach routes. Water was kept under beds because demons supposedly hated reflective surfaces. Some households even designated night guardians. This did not mean someone stayed up. It meant someone slept lighter and complained more loudly when they had bad dreams. Where nightmares were professional, in certain regions, demons were believed to have strict roles assigned by supernatural hierarchies. Medieval theologians seriously debated whether demons had organizational structures. Many concluded they did, complete with ranks, specialties, and territories. Nightmares weren't casual harassment. They were job performance. If a person suffered repeated nightmares, the common advice wasn't therapy. It was, pray harder, change sleeping position, increase protective objects, stop doing anything that makes demons interested in you. Nightmares weren't interpreted as internal distress. They were external surveillance. A demon visited because it had a reason. And if the same demon kept coming back, that meant it had a case file with your name on it. The most terrifying part. Demons didn't just show up because they enjoyed chaos. They showed up because humans became reachable at night. The boundaries thinned. The mind softened, the soul drifted, the world turned quiet, and if something wanted to whisper, press, prod, or torment, nighttime was the perfect shift. Evil didn't freelance. It worked night shifts. Long before the concept of mental health existed as anything other than not being possessed, the human mind was not believed to generate distress on its own. Early societies assumed the human soul was naturally quiet, peaceful, and obedient, like a child who never misbehaved unless taught to. So if your nights were filled with torment, fear, or disturbing imagery, the explanation wasn't psychological. It was moral. Something you did was calling out from the dark like an unpaid debt. Nightmares weren't merely nightmares. They were repercussions, the universe returning your behavior with interest. Sin had a nightlife. During the day, bad decisions could be hidden, denied, or debated. At night, however, sins became insomniac. They had plenty of time to wander your subconscious, gather their friends, and stage a midnight performance you could not escape. Medieval clergy preached that no wrongdoing ever stayed quiet. If your heart didn't confess it, your dreams would. Nightmares weren't random, they were exposures, a kind of internal whistleblowing. People were told, if you lied, your dreams would reveal falsehoods chasing you. If you stole, your dreams would trap you in mazes with no exit. If you lusted, you'd be tormented by terrifying seductions. If you cheated someone, your dream would place you among thieves. If you showed pride, you would fall endlessly in your sleep. Your moral record wasn't kept in heaven, it was kept in your pillow. Clergy encouraged this interpretation because nightmares made excellent teaching tools. The church didn't need to punish people. People punished themselves every time they closed their eyes. Guilt became the nighttime narrator. People of earlier eras weren't encouraged to explore emotions the way we do now. Anxiety wasn't anxiety, it was wrongdoing. Fear wasn't fear, it was contamination. Shame wasn't shame, it was deserved. If something troubled you internally, it was assumed to originate externally, from sin, demons, or improper behavior. So nightmares became personalized moral messages. Imagine coming to your village priest saying, "I had a terrifying dream." Modern psychology might ask, "How are you feeling lately? What stresses are around you? What do you think this reflects?" Historical clergy would answer, "What did you do?" Dreams became moral exams no one studied for. They also became the era's preferred delivery system for warnings. Stop doing that, or the nightmares will get worse. They always could get worse. Nightmares were moral currency, and the wallet never closed. The dreamer's confession. You didn't mean to make. In many cultures, dreams exposed secrets. A nightmare could reveal a hidden infidelity, a grudging resentment, a broken promise, a selfish act, a desire you denied, a fear you pretended not to have. Dreams were considered honest because they weren't controlled by the waking mind. If your dream showed you falling from a cliff, it meant you'd done something prideful. If you dreamed you were chased, someone said you were avoiding responsibility. If you dreamed of fire, your anger was burning you from the inside. Every nightmare was a moral mirror held too close to the face. People feared dreams not only because they were frightening, but because they revealed truths that daytime excuses tried to hide. Nightmares were teachers, strict ones. Instead of therapy, people got sermons. Instead of analyzing triggers, they were advised to analyze sins. Nightmares were moral instructors sent by God, gods, ancestors, or universal forces, depending on the culture. The message was universal. If you suffer at night, you must correct yourself by day. Nightmares served a social purpose too. They reinforced behaviors. Be honest, or dream of betrayal. Be generous, or dream of grasping hands. Stay faithful, or dream of punishment. Respect others, or dream of attack. Maintain purity, or dream of corruption. Dreams weren't about self-expression. They were about self-policing. Guilt became the all-night security guard patrolling your sleep for moral violations. No dream journal could protect you. The universe itself was journaling on your behalf. The uncomfortable accuracy problem. Of course, some nightmares were triggered by fear, stress, hunger, illness, or exhaustion. Conditions people experienced constantly. But without scientific explanations, these physical triggers were reassigned to moral causes. A farmer who starved himself too long might dream of devouring creatures. Clearly, said the village priest, this meant he had greed in his heart. A woman terrified by plague might dream of death pursuing her. Clearly, said the elders, she feared divine judgment. In other words, nightmares punished you even when life already had. People didn't question the interpretations because the timing made sense. They sinned by day, they suffered by night. It had rhythm, predictability, a kind of cosmic customer service. The lecture that lived in your pillow. Parents used nightmares as teaching moments. See, this is what happens when you lie. Well, if you helped your father more, you wouldn't dream of wolves. That's what guilt looks like. Learn from it. Priests use nightmares as sermons personalized to the audience. Clearly your soul is restless. Confess. This dream reflects pride. Humble yourself. This is a divine warning. Listen. Nightmares weren't psychological. They were disciplinary tools. And if your nightmares kept getting worse, that meant the universe was losing patience. The moral of the moral interpretation. When people had nightmares, the question wasn't, what's troubling my inner world? It was, which of my actions finally caught up to me? Nightmares were evidence, not emotion. Consequences, not confusion. A cosmic audit of your behavior. Therapy didn't exist. Guilt did, and it never slept. Before psychology existed, people didn't look inside the mind for explanations. They looked around the village for suspects, and nothing explained a nightmare quite as conveniently as witches. If you woke up sweating, gasping, bruised, or feeling like you'd been dragged through half the countryside, you weren't seen as unlucky. You were seen as ridden. This was not metaphorical riding. Witches in medieval imagination didn't just haunt dreams. They physically mounted sleeping bodies and used them as magical transportation. Humans, in this worldview, doubled as fuel-efficient broom substitutes. The witch got the ride, you got the nightmare. Everyone suffered except the witch, who apparently enjoyed excellent mileage. Riding was a literal accusation. Folklore didn't claim witches merely influenced dreams. They performed an action. They rode the sleeper. The German term Alpdruck, elf pressure, and related words in surrounding regions depicted a being pressing onto a sleeper. But witch-centric versions added motion. You weren't being sat on. You were being driven. A person who awoke exhausted was assumed to have been used as nocturnal horse. If you felt your arms heavy or your legs aching, this wasn't biology. It was cardio you didn't consent to. Medieval logic said no one should be that tired after sleeping, unless someone used them like a rental horse with no deposit fee. Nightmares weren't dreams, they were commutes. The witch's preferred vehicle. The image of the witch riding a person often included specific details. The witch straddled the sleeper's chest, shoulders, or back. She rode the spirit body, the physical body, or both simultaneously. The sleeper was carried through the air or across landscapes. The ride caused choking, panic, heat, or trembling. The witch sometimes tied the sleeper down or controlled their limbs. The sleeper returned to bed only when the witch was finished. Sleep paralysis, which we explored earlier, perfectly matched this narrative. Immobility felt like restraint. Chest pressure felt like riding weight. Breathlessness felt like being dragged at supernatural speed. And since witches were already believed to travel at night, the story practically wrote itself. Why witches rode people instead of brooms. Contrary to pop culture imagery, medieval Europe didn't initially imagine witches riding brooms into the sky. That came later. Before brooms became the vehicle of choice, witches were thought to ride animals, household tools, spirits, their victims. Anything that could be coerced into movement. Humans were especially useful because they combined mobility with vulnerability. Sleeping people didn't resist, and if they did wake mid-ride, which was frighteningly possible, they couldn't move. Further proof that the witch was in control. The victim wasn't just a passenger, they were the vehicle. The witch used their life force as fuel, their body as saddle, and their fear as added horsepower. the night ride as an explanation for symptoms, people frequently woke up with palpitations, shaking limbs, sore muscles, cuts or bruises, terrifying dreams, shortness of breath, a sense of falling, a feeling of having travelled a crushing emotional weight. Modern science has explanations for all of these. Medieval villagers had just one. A witch rode you last night. If several villagers experienced similar dreams or bodily sensations, it meant the witch was making multiple trips. Nightmares weren't random. They were busy nights for local practitioners of malice. Witch confessions didn't help. During witch trials, interrogators often asked whether the accused had ridden victims at night. Under torture, many confessed, describing elaborate journeys through the sky on the backs of their neighbours. The confessions reinforced the folklore, which reinforced the panic, which reinforced the accusations. This cyclical logic meant nightmares could literally cause arrests. If too many people woke up exhausted, the village didn't investigate diet or sleep patterns. They investigated women who owned cats. The spirit-body version. Not all versions involved physical riding. Some traditions held that witches rode the spirit of the sleeper, not the body. The witch would draw the soul out during sleep, ride it across landscapes, and return it only when finished. If the witch returned the soul incorrectly, upside down, backwards, or carelessly dropped, the person woke disoriented or ill. This belief did three things: explained nightmares, explained sudden sickness, ensured everyone feared upsetting the witch next door. Spirit riding offered a convenient way to justify otherwise unexplained suffering. Nightmares as evidence of witchcraft. Nightmares were used in court as proof that someone was being targeted. A villager proclaiming they had been ridden was enough to launch an inquiry. Symptoms considered proof included waking with witch marks, any bruise, feeling dragged across the bed, dreaming of flying unwillingly, feeling pressure on the chest, experiencing terror without cause, being unable to speak or scream. If a person experienced these repeatedly, it meant a witch had made them their horse. People feared falling asleep not because of dreams, but because they might become part of someone else's evening commute. The psychological cycle before psychology. This belief had a cruel feedback loop. Someone felt stressed. They slept poorly. They woke terrified. They believed they had been ridden. Fear increased. The next night was worse. Fear fed the nightmare, and the nightmare fed fear. Without a scientific understanding of sleep, people interpreted this as a witch growing stronger. The emotional reality. Being ridden wasn't just frightening, it was humiliating. It meant loss of control, loss of dignity, and a sense of being used. People felt violated by something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't prevent. This psychological weight translated into even more dreadful sleep, making the experience deeply real, even when the cause wasn't. The dark humour of the situation. Medieval people were often victims of their own biology, but they didn't know that. So instead of recognising sleep paralysis, neurological misfires, or nightmares, they believed they were nighttime transportation. You didn't toss and turn, you were being ridden like a midnight mule. In an era before forensic science, when legal systems were still figuring out what counted as proof and what counted as storytelling, nightmares slipped into the courtroom with surprising authority. If you dreamed you were attacked by a witch or tormented by a demon, that wasn't treated as a psychological event. It was treated as an eyewitness account, just delivered during non-business hours. Nightmares weren't fantasies, they weren't metaphors, they were testimony, and in many cases the kind judges nodded at as if someone had just recited property boundaries. The courtroom believed in two worlds, day and night. Judges in early modern Europe often accepted that nighttime experiences could reveal truths invisible in the daytime. They believed the boundaries between realms weakened at night, allowing witches, demons, spirits, and malicious forces to act more openly. So if a villager reported being strangled in a dream, being chased through the night, being visited by a witch-shaped figure, seeing an accused neighbour appear in spectral form, feeling pressure, weight, or clawing. Hearing voices in the dark, the courts heard it as real, experiential evidence, not dreams, not imagination, not psychology. Night ambassadors reporting what the human eye could not see. Legal culture didn't divide waking and dreaming. It divided day world and night world, and both were admissible. Nightmares became testimony. The logic worked like this. Witches had supernatural powers. These powers were strongest at night. They could appear in dreams to torment or harm. Therefore, a nightmare involving a witch was proof that the witch acted. Dreams weren't internal. They were arenas where witches carried out crimes beyond the limits of daylight. If your nightmare showed the accused harming you, that meant the accused had spiritually committed the act. It didn't matter that your body remained unharmed. The spiritual realm had its own laws, and courts treated spiritual harm as real harm. Dream evidence in witch trials. Nightmare testimony reached its peak during witch trial eras, most notably the Basque witch trials, 1609-1614, the Trier witch trials, 1580s, the Salem witch trials, 1692, the Swedish Mora trials, 1669, the North Berwick trials in Scotland, 1590. In these cases, witnesses commonly stated things like, "She came to me in my sleep. I felt her choking me in the night. I saw him sitting on my chest. Her spirit rode me until dawn. He appeared in my dream and harmed my child." And instead of asking, "Were you asleep?" judges asked, "Was anyone else with her?" or "Describe what she wore." Sleep states were not disqualifiers. They were locations where crimes occurred. Spectral evidence, when spirits took the stand. America's Salem courts famously accepted spectral evidence, meaning the ghost, spirit, or dream image of an accused person was treated as the accused themselves. If you dreamed that a neighbour's spirit attacked you, the court concluded, the neighbour sent their spectral form. They knowingly harmed you. They were guilty unless proven innocent, a nearly impossible task. People swore oaths, not about waking events, but about nocturnal encounters. Nightmare-based accusations resulted in arrests, imprisonment, and executions. A simple bad dream could kill someone because the courts believed dreams did not lie. Nightmares supported by physical signs. Some nightmares didn't arrive alone. If someone woke with bruises, scratches, red marks, sore limbs, a sensation of choking, a feeling of being crushed, extreme exhaustion, those symptoms became the physical corroboration of a dream. Judges didn't suspect muscle cramps, sleep paralysis, or tangled blankets. They suspected witch-riding spiritual assault. A demon's touch, a witch's familiar scratching the victim, a curse physically manifesting during the night. Nightmares were the testimony. Marks on the body were the evidence. Nightmares as motivational tools. Nightmare-based accusations weren't always malicious. Sometimes they emerged from genuine fear. A person who believed they had been attacked at night often sincerely thought a witch was targeting them. The dream didn't feel like imagination. It felt like survival instinct. Victims came to court trembling, sleep-deprived and wide-eyed, describing nocturnal torment they couldn't explain. The legal system, lacking science, treated these witnesses as credible, not delusional. If someone said, "I saw her in my dream," the court didn't question the dream. It questioned the accused. Nightmares were not emotional experiences, they were crime scenes, how a dream became a conviction. A typical nightmare-based accusation might unfold like this. A villager wakes up terrified. They recall seeing a neighbour's face in the dream. They interpret it as a witch attack. They tell a family member. Word spreads. Pressure builds to report it. The person testifies in court. The court accepts the testimony. The accused is interrogated and possibly tortured. A confession, real or forced, follows. Execution or imprisonment begins. the nightmare became a seed that grew into legal catastrophe. Why courts accepted nightmares. Early legal systems lacked medical explanations, psychological frameworks, understanding of sleep, awareness of hallucinations, concepts of subconscious fear. But they had two things: a belief in supernatural crime, a belief that dreams were external events. A credible dream was as good as a credible witness. After all, demons and witches couldn't be seen during the day. Night was the only time they left evidence, and so nightmares climbed onto the witness stand, swore oaths, and pointed their spectral fingers. The humour in the horror. From a modern view, the situation feels absurd. Your Honour, the accused assaulted me. When? Approximately 2:47 a.m. in my sleep. Were you conscious? No. Did anyone else see it? Just me. Case accepted. The demon came after bedtime, and the court scheduled a hearing. If you lived in a heavily Christianized society before psychology existed, your bedroom wasn't merely a place for sleep. It was a spiritual battleground with poor lighting. Dreams weren't considered random firings of the sleeping brain. They were believed to be communications, temptations, or assaults. And when a dream turned disturbing, unnerving, or embarrassingly enthusiastic, the explanation wasn't your unconscious. It was the devil doing unauthorized overtime. In Christian thought, Satan and his associates had many responsibilities, but one of their most efficient strategies was attacking while humans slept. Daytime offered too much resistance. People were alert, active, and occasionally supervised by clergy. Nighttime was the devil's free playground. You were unconscious, vulnerable, and, from Satan's perspective, conveniently located in a soft bed with the lights off. Perfect conditions for spiritual sabotage. The devil didn't need doors. Early Christians believed evil could not only enter a room uninvited, it actively preferred sneaking in. The devil, in folklore and sermons, bypassed locks, windows, walls, and moral boundaries with the ease of someone ignoring a "do not disturb" sign. There was no need to knock. Bedrooms were porous, permeable, spiritually unprotected unless fortified with prayer or symbols. Nighttime was when these defences weakened. The sleeping body was not considered inert. It was a gate left ajar, and the devil loved open gates. Dreams as satanic messages. Christian theology framed dreams in several ways. Divine dreams came from God, angels, or saints. Natural dreams came from ordinary bodily processes. Demonic dreams came from the devil or demons attempting to corrupt the soul. Guess which category everyone remembered most? Demonic dreams weren't subtle. They involved terrifying visions, violent imagery, manipulated memories, distorted faces, dark landscapes, moral temptations, sexual scenarios, allegorical horrors. Anything capable of making a medieval Christian sit bolt upright in bed and immediately reevaluate all their life choices was assigned to the devil's night shift. Dreams weren't interpreted symbolically the way they are now. They were interpreted as literal interventions. If the devil could not persuade you by day, he could whisper into your dreams at night, where your guard was down and your sense of reality was easily manipulated. Sexual dreams were the devil's favourite crime. One of the most distinctive Christian nightmare categories was the nocturnal sexual dream, something medieval theologians took very seriously. If you dreamed about desire, intimacy, or anything the church considered inappropriate, the explanation wasn't biology. It wasn't the mind processing experiences. It wasn't stress, hormones, or subconscious longing. It was a demon, or the devil, or a demon working for the devil, or the devil working through your weakness, or all of the above. The theology went like this. Good Christians would never entertain such thoughts. Therefore, if you dreamed them, someone planted them, that someone was Satan. Therefore, the dream was evidence of attempted corruption. You weren't responsible for the dream, but you were responsible for how guilty you felt afterward. The devil didn't just tempt, he embarrassed. The devil's timing was strategic demons, and the devil targeted sleepers because sleep weakened physical resistance, sleep disrupted rational thinking, sleep allowed imagery to feel real, sleep allowed emotional manipulation, sleep opened the spiritual doors of the mind. In other words, Satan knew that nighttime was prime time. Christians believed he waited until the body was relaxed and the mind was unguarded. Only then could he lead the dreamer into scenarios designed to trigger panic, shame, doubt, or sinful impulse. The devil didn't knock. He waited until you were snoring. The nocturnal assault theology. Some medieval texts describe demonic attacks as literal assaults on the sleeping body, just not always physically visible. People woke with racing hearts, trembling limbs, a sense of suffocation, flashing images, feelings of dread, sudden guilt, heavy exhaustion, residual panic. Obviously, the devil had been upon them, theologians explained. Sleep paralysis experiences also fit neatly into this model. A person waking frozen in fear. That wasn't biology. That was Satan pinning you down just long enough to make a point. If you screamed but no sound came out, the devil silenced your voice. If you felt pressed by a weight on your chest, the devil had literally come upon you. From a modern standpoint, the brain was misfiring. From a Christian medieval standpoint, Satan was extremely hands-on. Dream confession culture. Because dreams were believed to expose spiritual vulnerability, Christians were encouraged to confess troubling dreams, even though the dreamer was not considered morally responsible. Confession wasn't about guilt, it was about surveillance. Clergy wanted to track Satan's activity the way meteorologists track storms. If a person confessed a disturbing dream, the priest interpreted it as either a demonic temptation, a warning sent by God, a sign the dreamer was spiritually weakening, a sign the devil was paying special attention. Either way, someone was keeping tabs. Protection required bedtime rituals. If Satan targeted bedrooms, then bedrooms needed spiritual fortification. Christians responded with crosses hung above beds, psalms recited before sleep, evening prayers for protection, holy water sprinkled on pillows, amulets containing scripture, images of saints placed near the headboard, avoidance of sinful thoughts. Before sleep, good luck. Night was dangerous. But with the right protections, you could sleep with one eye metaphorically open. The emotional impact was real. To be told that your nightmares were not accidents, but personalized attacks from the devil, shaped how people approached fear. A nightmare wasn't frightening simply because of its content. It was frightening because of what it meant. You weren't dreaming. You were being evaluated, tested, hunted, targeted for corruption. That kind of interpretation made every disturbing dream feel like a sign of spiritual warfare. A chilling thought for someone living without the comforts of modern understanding. A night visitor who didn't need permission. The devil did not politely schedule appointments. He didn't need doors, didn't follow rules, and definitely didn't respect boundaries. He used dreams as messages, manipulations, and midnight intrusions. He didn't knock. He waited until you were asleep. Before psychology offered symbolic interpretations and before medicine offered germ theory, dreams were not understood as random mental narratives. They were messages, warnings, sometimes even ultimatums. And the most frightening dreams weren't the ones filled with monsters or witches or demons. They were the ones that felt heavy, strange, or final. These weren't considered nightmares. They were omens, and omens rarely came with good news. When people dreamed badly, they weren't told to calm down, drink water, or practice mindfulness. They were told to get their affairs in order. Nightmares were a forecast, not a symptom. In many cultures stretching from ancient Mesopotamia to early modern Europe to various indigenous societies, nightmares were viewed as pre-death signals. A nightmare wasn't simply fear or stress. It was a messenger with a grim delivery schedule. People kept track of dreams the way we track blood pressure. A dream of falling. Someone nearby might be dying. A dream of drowning. Illness approaching. A dream of being chased. Spirits warning of danger. A dream of wandering through darkness. A soul preparing to depart. A dream of lost teeth. A relative might die, a belief found in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns everyone believed in. And because life was unpredictable and survival uncertain, people were primed to hear messages where they feared consequences. Nightmares didn't reflect the mind. They reflected fate. Death was rarely a surprise. Nightmares announced it. When someone fell sick suddenly, people often recalled that the patient had a nightmare recently. The nightmare wasn't seen as emotional stress before sickness. It was seen as the cause or announcement. A village grandmother might whisper, "He dreamed of water last night. It means his life is thinning." Or, "She saw shadows in her sleep. Someone will cross over." Nightmares became diagnostic tools in societies where medicine was sparse, doctors were expensive, and the line between illness and death was razor thin. If people didn't understand pathogens, they understood patterns. Nightmares provided a framework, a fear you could read. Dream interpreters treated nightmares as alerts. In many regions, specialists emerged, interpreters, shamans, priests, wise women, who were called upon when nightmares struck. These interpreters were not analysing psychology, they were analysing destiny. Their questions weren't, "What were you feeling?" They were, "Who did you see? How did you move? What direction did you travel? Was water present? Was the moon full?" Details mattered because they were believed to encode the future. A nightmare of being trapped might signal confinement by illness. A nightmare of hunger might predict famine. A nightmare of a dark figure might signify an approaching death. People believed the world beyond the visible one was trying to prepare them. Nightmares weren't frightening. They were informative. Terrifying, yes, but informative. Bad dreams and community anxiety. Nightmares didn't stay private. If someone had a particularly disturbing dream, neighbours wanted to know. Families wanted to know. Entire communities could become tense if someone described a dream of catastrophe. A single nightmare might trigger ritual cleansing, family meetings, extra prayer, protective charms, avoidance of travel, temporary fasting, increased observation of the dreamer. Nightmares were treated as weather warnings issued by the supernatural. If someone dreamed of death, everyone took cover. Nightmares before plagues. During outbreaks of disease, nightmare interpretations became even more intense. People knew something was coming: sickness, famine, war, and nightmares felt like the universe's early alarm system. Accounts from the Black Death, various European famines, and epidemics in Asia and the Middle East frequently mention terrifying dreams that preceded the arrival of illness. Some people dreamed of burning fields, others dreamed of pale figures knocking on doors, others dreamed of choking, drowning, or suffocating. Without medical knowledge, these were interpreted as warnings. It's not that nightmares caused the plagues, it's that plagues caused fear, and fear caused nightmares, and nightmares confirmed the fear, a perfect cycle of pre-scientific dread. Dreams that announced another person's death. Many traditions believed you could dream of someone else's death before it happened, not symbolically, literally. You might dream of a relative in trouble, or see their image in shadow, or hear their voice calling. This was considered a sign their soul was preparing to leave the world. People didn't wake from such dreams thinking, "What an odd subconscious metaphor." They woke thinking, "I must warn them." And sometimes, tragically, the dreamer's fear created its own fulfillment. If the person did become ill or suffer misfortune, the nightmare gained prophetic credibility. This built cultural memory. Nightmares predict death because sometimes nightmares appear before death. In small communities, patterns didn't need to be statistically accurate. They only needed to be memorable. Nightmares and mortality. Awareness. Nightmares were an emotional outlet in societies obsessed with survival. Death wasn't distant. It was part of daily life. Children died. Parents died. Neighbors died. Soldiers died. Strangers died. Illness appeared without explanation. Night travel was dangerous. Warfare erupted abruptly. Food could run out. Mortality was loud and constant. When people dreamed of danger or loss, it made emotional sense to interpret those dreams as previews rather than echoes. Nightmares became a cultural coping mechanism disguised as prophecy. The fear of death didn't hide in the subconscious. It walked into dreams and announced itself. The doctor was not the first call. If you dreamed of sickness, people didn't call a physician. Physicians were expensive and historically not very helpful. Instead, they doubled down on rituals, burning incense, lighting protective lamps, summoning clergy, wearing amulets, avoiding unlucky foods, changing sleeping positions, fasting, praying. You didn't need medicine. You needed to stop dreaming. The nightmare's cultural health system. Before medicine was trustworthy, dreams filled the gap. Nightmares were diagnostic tools, warning systems, community alarms, emotional barometers, spiritual messages. If someone dreamed badly, it wasn't about imagination. It was about survival. Because in a world full of real danger, nightmares weren't illusions. They were previews of the worst things that could happen, and sometimes did. Long before nutrition labels, calories, or don't eat spicy food after 9 p.m.'s health articles, people believed that dinner was not just a meal. It was a moral and metaphysical gamble. Food didn't merely fill your stomach. It shaped your dreams, influenced your sleep, and, if you were unlucky or gluttonous, opened your door to an entire 4-course nightmare. Nightmares caused by dinner weren't seen as random indigestion. They were seen as spiritual disturbances, bodily imbalances, punishments for overeating, signals from offended foods, warnings sent by the body's internal hierarchy. People didn't ask, "What did I eat?" They asked, "What did I anger?" Food and nightmares had a direct line of communication. Ancient and medieval medical traditions were built on the idea that the body had humours, fluids governing mood, health, and behaviour. Eating the wrong food meant upsetting this carefully balanced internal ecosystem, and when the humours were upset, they complained, loudly, in your dreams. A plate of fatty meat wasn't simply indulgent. It was a contract stating you would see something alarming during the night. A heavy stew late in the evening wasn't a cosy dinner. It was a supernatural dare. Anything too greasy, too salty, too sweet, too cold, too hot, too wild, too unfamiliar, or too large was capable of generating dream terrors. The stomach didn't just digest, it reacted, and that reaction manifested as a horrifying dreamscape. The stomach was a nighttime storyteller. Pre-modern people thought the stomach had opinions, strong ones, and if you ignored those opinions, it would punish you in a language you couldn't misunderstand. Nightmares, overeating, dream of being chased, undereating, dream of scarcity, starvation, or cold, eating something too exotic, dream of bizarre, fantastical creatures, eating spoiled food, dream of death or sickness, eating too much meat, dream of beasts, blood, or violence, eating too close to bedtime, dream of suffocation, drowning, or being weighed down by shadows. Everything that happened in the gut was believed to translate upward into dream symbolism. The stomach was basically your nighttime playwright, dramatic, petty, and impossible to ignore. The medieval menu of nightmare triggers. If you wanted a peaceful night's sleep, here were foods you absolutely should not eat, according to old advice. Pork, because it generated unruly, stubborn dreams. Goat, because goats were considered unruly and stubborn. Simple logic. Cheese, especially aged cheese, because it thickened the mind. Beans, because they caused gas, and gas was believed to trap spirits. Onions and garlic, because their scent travelled to the brain. Salted meats, because salt heated the blood. Shellfish, because coastal foods carried unpredictable humours. Fruits late in the day, because cold foods created cold dreams. Cold dreams weren't calm dreams. They were dreams of ghosts, graves, and things with too many fingers. Meanwhile, dairy eaten at night was believed to cause dreams of monstrous transformations, because milk was associated with softness, vulnerability, and shape-shifting animals. Someone who ate cheese before bed and dreamed of turning into a wolf didn't blame their imagination. They blamed the cheese. Dinner timing was a high-stakes game. You could technically eat anything, if you did exactly one thing right. Eat early enough that your stomach had settled before sleep. Nighttime digestion was seen as chaotic, unpredictable, and morally questionable. If you digested food in the dark, the process became stealthy, unsupervised, and prone to misbehavior. People genuinely feared that sleep and digestion were incompatible tasks, like trying to write a letter while running. A too-late dinner guaranteed restless dreaming, night sweats, suffocation imagery, chasing dreams, falling dreams, dreams of unpleasant animals, visions of strangers entering the home. In their logic, if the stomach works too hard at night, it generates fumes. Those fumes travel to the brain. The brain interprets fumes as visions. Visions become nightmares. This was the original "don't eat after 7 p.m. rule, except it was enforced by fear, not fitness. The body was thought to host an internal debate. People believed food entered a complex internal system of negotiation. Different organs argued about how to process your meal. If the stomach won, you slept fine. If the liver won, your dreams turned feverish. If the heart took over, you dreamed of romance or sorrow. If the spleen intervened, bad luck, because the spleen was believed to produce fear, and God forbid the stomach got overwhelmed. An overwhelmed stomach meant its vapours could reach the brain, disturbing sleep and generating horrifying night imagery. You didn't have heartburn. You had internal political unrest. Food had personalities and reputations. People assigned human traits to ingredients. Heavy foods were lazy, causing sluggish dreams. Spicy foods were aggressive, causing violent dreams. Sweet foods were seductive, causing erotic dreams. Sour foods were anxious, causing chaotic dreams. Rotten foods were angry, causing death dreams. Wild game was restless, causing frantic dreams. Everyone knew a meal could go wrong, but in past societies, a meal could also go malevolent. Rituals to prevent dinner-induced nightmares. Because food could ruin your night, people developed prevention rituals. Sleep on the right side, considered cooling to the stomach. Drink mint or fennel broth after a heavy meal. Place lavender under pillows. Burn herbs to calm the humours. Avoid talking too much after dinner, so the stomach wouldn't get confused. Eat bread last to seal the meal properly. Walk 3 circles around the house to settle the food. Everyone had their version of a bedtime ritual, but almost all revolved around one idea. Food was unpredictable. You had to tame it before bed. Nightmares were a culinary risk. Dinner wasn't nourishment. It was a negotiation between body and night. Eat too much, too little, too strangely. Too late, too mixed, or too fast, and the night would retaliate. Nightmares weren't psychological distress. They were culinary consequences, served after dark, with no chance to send the plate back. Before clocks standardized time and psychology standardized emotions, people explained the rhythms of their inner worlds through the rhythms of the natural world. And no celestial body did more emotional heavy lifting than the moon. The moon wasn't just a glowing ornament in the night sky. It was a supervisor, a regulator of mood, a meddler in sleep, and, depending on the phase, the cosmic equivalent of a manager standing too close while you worked. If you dreamed peacefully, the moon had been gentle. If you dreamed violently, the moon had been moody. If you didn't dream at all, the moon must have turned its face away. And if you had nightmares during a full moon, well, that was entirely expected. Full moons didn't just illuminate the earth, they illuminated your subconscious, sometimes in ways you absolutely did not ask for. The moon governed minds as surely as tides. Across the ancient world, the moon was believed to tug at human beings the same way it tugged at the ocean. The logic was simple and poetic. The moon moves great bodies of water. Humans are mostly water, therefore the moon moves humans too. Nightmares, insomnia, sleepwalking, restlessness, anxiety, and sudden bursts of emotion were all attributed to lunar influence. Modern people blame blue light. Ancient people blamed moonlight. You weren't overstimulated. You were moonstruck, a real term with centuries of fear behind it. Lunacy. When the moon took your sanity for a walk. The word lunatic literally means mooned. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. Physicians, priests, and scholars believed the moon loosened thoughts, disturbed emotional boundaries, agitated the blood-awakened hidden fears, distorted dreams. People who behaved strangely during certain lunar phases weren't labelled unstable. They were labelled influenced. Their minds weren't malfunctioning. The moon had simply dialed their thoughts a few notches off-centre. Nightmares born under the full moon weren't considered personal. They were considered cosmic side effects, the mental version of high tide. Full moons were nighttime emergencies. During a full moon, the sky was too bright for comfort. The world didn't look asleep. It looked awake and pale, like a ghost trying to pretend it was a flashlight. Shadows sharpened, animals grew restless. People swore they heard unusual noises, creaking branches, footsteps, low moans, distant cries. Every one of these sensations amplified dreams. If you dreamed vividly, the moon had infused you with too much light. If you dreamed violently, the moon had filled your body with moist heat. If you dreamed of monsters, the moon had overfed your imagination. If you dreamed of sorrow, the moon had weighed upon your spirit. Nightmares themselves were seen as moon-sent messages, warnings to stay indoors, behave carefully, or avoid important decisions until the moon waned. The moon watched you sleep. Literally, some traditions believed moonlight itself was dangerous. If a sleeping person faced the moon, or if moonbeams touched their face, the lunar influence penetrated the body. This could disturb dreams, weaken mental defenses, distort the sleeper's thoughts, open the soul to spirits, stir old memories into frightening images. Parents were warned never to let children sleep with the moon shining on them. A child's open eyes could drink in the moon's power while unconscious. Adults were told the same thing, albeit with less tenderness. Closing the curtains wasn't about privacy. It was about survival. Crescent moons had a different personality. While the full moon was the dramatic troublemaker, the crescent moon was considered sly. It didn't overwhelm you, it whispered. Dreams during crescent phases were believed to be subtle, symbolic, and easily misinterpreted. These weren't nightmares of terror. They were nightmares of confusion, getting lost, losing objects, chasing shadows, wandering strange landscapes, being unable to speak, hearing faint voices calling your name. The crescent moon wasn't malicious. It was cryptic. It muddled your thoughts and nudged your subconscious into strange, wandering corridors. The new moon, the most mysterious phase. When the moon disappeared from the sky entirely, people believed dreams lost their guidance. Consciousness floated unanchored nightmares weren't directed. They were chaotic spirits moved more freely without lunar oversight. Nightmares during the new moon had no narrative structure. They were shapeless, fragmented, and frighteningly random, like your brain was flipping through channels too quickly. These were the dreams that left people waking up gasping, with no memory except a lingering sense of dread. The moon as an emotional mirror. Cultures across the world attributed emotional states to lunar phases. Full moon, intensity, passion, fear, violence. Waning moon, sadness, introspection, endings. Waxing moon, energy, anticipation, unpredictable movement. New moon, vulnerability, instability, fragile consciousness. Nightmares weren't personal failures, they were emotional reflections of the sky. If the moon struggled, you struggled. If the moon glowed too brightly, your thoughts overheated. If the moon hid, your dreams wandered blindly. The moon was the universe's emotional thermostat, sometimes malfunctioning, always influential. Lunar calendars were dream calendars. People planned their sleep around moon cycles, avoid heavy dreams near the full moon, practice extra prayers during crescents, wear protective charms during the new moon, keep windows closed when moonlight was strongest, sleep facing away from the light, avoid certain foods when lunar influence peaked. Entire bedtime routines revolved around protecting oneself from the moon's moods. Nightmares didn't simply happen. They were scheduled by lunar bureaucracy. Why the moon made sense as a nightmare architect. In a world with little artificial light, the moon was a dramatic presence. Its brightness changed the appearance of everything. Forests looked alive, fields shimmered, rivers glowed. Shadows, lengthened animals behaved strangely. Night felt eerily illuminated. It was natural for people to believe the moon didn't just light the world, it stirred it. If your dreams turned chaotic, it wasn't your mind misfiring. It was the sky meddling. Insomnia wasn't a health issue, it was astronomy. Nightmares weren't subconscious fears, they were lunar interference, insomnia sponsored by the sky. Before psychology existed, and before pet ownership became a hobby involving themed sweaters and birthday treats, animals sleeping near humans had a very different reputation. They weren't comforting. They weren't loyal nighttime companions. They weren't emotional support creatures. They were dream disruptors, breath thieves, and spiritual liabilities. If you woke up terrified and your cat was sitting on your chest, people didn't say, "Oh, how cute." They said, "Well, there's your problem." In many cultures, the presence of an animal during sleep was enough to explain nightmares entirely. You didn't have anxiety, you didn't have stress, you just had a dog that wandered too close. Animals were thought to tamper with dream boundaries. The idea was simple. Sleeping created a vulnerable state. Humans drifted halfway into the spiritual world, leaving the body temporarily vacant or lightly defended. Animals, existing in what many believed was a more instinctual liminal state, could accidentally or intentionally tamper with that boundary. Cats were especially suspected for this. Their ability to move, silently appear, suddenly stare with unsettling confidence, sit directly on your lungs, purr ominously like a tiny demon generator made them prime suspects. People genuinely believed cats interfered with dreams not because of any malice, but because cats had no respect for the delicate human soul-to-body connection. Dogs, on the other hand, were considered emotionally connected to humans, sometimes too connected. A dog sleeping near a person could absorb or reflect the owner's emotions, dreams, or fears. At best, it muddled the dreamscape. At worst, it transmitted its own instinctive visions into the human mind. A dream of running frantically might not be fear. It might be your dog's evening fantasy bleeding into your sleep. Breath stealing, a genuine historical theory. Many societies believed animals could literally steal breath, either intentionally or accidentally. This was especially true for cats. Their habit of curling up on the chest or neck of sleeping humans made people suspicious. A cat sitting on a baby's chest. A medieval explanation. The cat wants the child's breath. A modern explanation. The cat wants warmth. Guess which explanation caught on historically? Breath stealing wasn't always considered a murderous act. Sometimes it simply meant the animal inhaled your vital spirit by accident, like a roommate accidentally drinking your soup. And when the body was deprived of vital breath, dreams became chaotic, desperate, and frightening. Nightmares were the brain's complaint letter. Dream of suffocation. Your cat sat on you. Dream of running out of air. Your dog breathed too close. Dream of drowning. The goat in the corner of the house snored weirdly. Livestock. Had nighttime reputations. Too many households didn't just share their bedrooms with pets, they shared space with livestock. Chickens, goats, cows, and even pigs sometimes slept inside homes for warmth or protection. This created an entire ecosystem of nighttime blame. A cow's restless shifting could shake the spiritual balance. A goat's presence was believed to attract mischief or trickster spirits. Roosters crowing at odd hours were omens that could trigger nightmares instantly. Pigs were thought to emit heavy, thick vapours that clouded the sleeper's mind. Livestock dreams weren't symbolic. They were environmental hazards. If you dreamt of horns, hooves, or being chased, you didn't interpret it psychologically. Someone simply concluded that the goat breathed too near your blanket. Animals were bridges between worlds. In pre-scientific thought, animals lived closer to nature, closer to the unseen, and closer to whatever forces operated invisibly in the night. They were believed to sense spirits, invite spirits, repel spirits, attract dreams, disrupt dreams, transmit dreams. Basically, animals were considered Wi-Fi routers for the supernatural, although no one asked for that service. Sleeping near them meant your mind might accidentally connect to whatever channel the animal was tuned to. If your pig dreamed of food, you might dream of gluttony. If your horse dreamed of running, you might wake up from a chase. If your cat dreamed of hunting, you might dream of being hunted. People believed dreams flowed between creatures the way warmth did. Cats were the most suspicious sleeping partners. Cats had an especially rich portfolio of accusations. They sat on chests, causing pressure dreams. They stared at sleepers, pulling energy through the eyes. They walked across sleeping bodies, interrupting the soul's alignment. They emitted heat that softened the mind, leading to vivid nightmares. They were associated with witches, and therefore could transmit witch dreams by proximity. If anyone dreamed of dark figures, shadows, shifting shapes, or mysterious movement, villagers often asked, "Where was your cat last night?" Nightmare prevention. Through animal management, people created strict rules to prevent animals from causing dream disruption. Keep cats out of the bedroom at night. Tie dogs far enough away that their breath can't mingle with yours. Move livestock to a separate enclosure after sunset. Cover your face while sleeping to protect your breath. Avoid letting animals cross your legs or arms, which could block spiritual circulation. Never fall asleep near animals during lunar transitions. Too many moving influences. Nighttime wasn't just about managing sleep. It was about managing everyone else's sleep too. Animals were dream mirrors. Some traditions believed animals unintentionally reflected the dreams of the humans around them. If you slept next to a frightened animal, you absorbed its fear. If you slept next to an anxious dog, your dreams pulsed with tension. If you slept near a restless cow, you dreamed of wandering fields. People woke from nightmares thinking, "That wasn't my dream. That was the animal's dream hitting me." This explanation made perfect sense in societies where animals were part of daily life. Humans and animals worked together, travelled together, lived together, and, during cold months, slept together. Dream sharing seemed like an extension of that intimacy, the humour and horror of it all. Imagine waking up sweaty, terrified, heart-racing and telling your family, "I had a nightmare." And the first response is, "Where was the chicken sleeping?" Your nightmare wasn't emotional. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't demonic. It wasn't moral. It was proximity related. Your pet wasn't cuddling. It was interfering. Today, When a child wakes up shrieking from a nightmare, adults comfort them, explain what dreams are, and maybe leave a nightlight on. But in earlier centuries, before psychology, before child development theories, before anyone considered emotional support a real thing, children's nightmares weren't treated as harmless. They were treated as evidence. A child who dreamed badly wasn't afraid. They were compromised. Nightmares in children raised alarms because adults believed children were spiritual soft targets. Their souls weren't fully formed, their morals were under construction, and their minds were considered absorbent, like sponges soaking up whatever forces crept around at night. If a child had a nightmare, it meant something got to them, something dangerous, something corrupting, something adults needed to fix immediately. Nightmares revealed disobedience. The simplest explanation for a bad dream was moral failure. If a child lied during the day, adults expected nightmares at night. If a child disobeyed a parent, nightmares were the natural consequence. If a child stole a treat, nightmares were inevitable. In many households, a nightmare wasn't a reason for comfort, it was a reason for a lecture. You see, that's what happens when you disobey. You dream of shadows because the shadows inside you grew. You wouldn't be frightened if you behaved. Children weren't allowed to simply be scared. They had to be responsible for it. Nightmares became behavior reports, unsettling but informative. Fear was read as a moral barometer. Children were expected to be innocent, pure, and receptive to goodness. If they deviated, by having disturbing dreams, adults assumed something had influenced them. This influence wasn't psychological stress, overstimulation, or trauma. It was a sinful thought, a bad action, a hidden desire, an unconfessed wrongdoing. The child's unconscious was not a place of imagination. It was a moral storage bin. If a child dreamed of frightening animals, an adult might say, "Then you must have been wild today." If they dreamed of being chased, "You're running from your duties." If they dreamed of falling, "You haven't been steady in your obedience." Nightmares weren't just interpreted, they were weaponized. Spiritually vulnerable, children as easy targets. Children were believed to be spiritually permeable. Adults had thicker moral barriers, children were open fields. Nighttime, already dangerous, was even more so for the young. Spirits, demons, mischief beings, witches, or wandering shadows could easily influence a child's dream. Nightmares were alarm bells that something had entered. The home, the child's room, the child's mind, the child's spirit. Parents took these dreams seriously, not because they understood fear, but because they feared outside interference. If a child woke screaming, the question wasn't, "What scared you?" It was, "What got in?" Parents examined dreams. Like investigators, children were questioned the way detectives interrogate suspects. What exactly did you see? Did the creature speak? Did anyone touch you? Were you running or hiding? Was there fire, water, darkness? The answers weren't treated as imagination. They were treated as clues. A dream of being grabbed might indicate a witch's spiritual attack. A dream of a shadow figure might suggest a demon passing near the home. A dream of a lost toy might symbolize a child's moral confusion. A dream of drowning could mean the child was overwhelmed by sin. Kids weren't storytellers, they were witnesses. Nightmares became parenting tools. If a child had a nightmare, adults used it to reinforce proper behavior. This is why you must pray. This is why you must obey quickly. This is why you shouldn't play with things you're told to avoid. This is why you must keep your thoughts clean. This is why you should listen to your elders. Children learned fast. Fear wasn't something you expressed. It was something you caused. They weren't comforted for nightmares. They were corrected. Dream correction techniques. Because adults saw nightmares as moral signals, they had many solutions. None involved reassurance. 1. immediate confession. The child had to confess every wrongdoing from the day. A clean conscience was believed to prevent bad dreams. 2. Protective prayers. The child repeated structured prayers meant to guard the soul during sleep. 3. Cleansing rituals. Parents washed the child's face or hands with blessed or herb-infused water to remove lingering spirits. 4. Behavioral adjustments. If a child dreamed of chaos, adults insisted they had been chaotic. Order was enforced. If a child dreamed of fear, adults insisted they had been cowardly. Toughness was enforced. If a child dreamed of disobedience, adults insisted the dream reflected real defiance. Discipline followed. 5. Sleeping restrictions. Children weren't allowed to sleep in certain positions, with certain toys, near certain windows, or near pets. Each restriction served as a protective measure, at least in adult imagination. The nightmare blame cycle. Nightmares created fear. Fear created confession. Confession created guilt. Guilt created more fear, and fear caused more nightmares. Adults interpreted this cycle as spiritual warfare. Today, we'd interpret it as a child under extreme emotional pressure. But historically, the cycle was seen as a warning, a correction, a teaching moment, necessary discipline. A child who had multiple nightmares in 1 week didn't get sympathy. They got additional supervision. When children's nightmares became community worries, repeated nightmares could become a village concern. People assumed the household was spiritually unclean. Someone in the family was committing secret sins. A witch was targeting the child. The child had attracted malevolent interest. A spirit was wandering near their home. Children's dreams were like weather reports for adults, early indicators that something dangerous was approaching. Parents panicked because nightmares implied vulnerability. Villagers panicked because nightmares implied proximity. The bitter humour of it all. Imagine being a terrified 6-year-old trying to explain a bad dream, only to be told, "You dream of monsters because you didn't do your chores." Childhood fear, but make it a disciplinary issue. Nightmares weren't signs of innocence disturbed, they were signs of innocence failing. And every child knew, if you dreamed badly, you must have done something wrong. Or worse, something was coming for you. Before psychology offered explanations involving trauma, memory, or anxiety, people understood nightmares as forms of communication, couriers from the other side, arriving whether you invited them or not. If you dreamed of pressure on your shoulders, a voice calling your name, a distant figure, a cold presence, or a sudden surge of fear, the conclusion wasn't, "My mind is stressed." It was, "A dead relative wants something." The dead, in many cultures, were not done with the living. They had opinions, they had needs, they had unresolved business. Worst of all, they had no respect for your sleep schedule. The ancestors weren't quiet. In societies worldwide, from ancient China to medieval Europe to indigenous traditions, dreams were considered meeting grounds where the living and dead could interact. The dead didn't appear as hallucinations. They appeared as themselves, with the same personality traits they had in life. If your grandmother was stern before she died, you could expect her spectral form to maintain that management style in your dreams. Nightmares were rarely random. They were reminders, warnings, complaints, requests, unfinished conversations, scoldings, expressions of dissatisfaction. It wasn't enough to care for the living. You had to care for the dead too. Fear was their way of getting your attention. The dead weren't believed to be malicious, usually. They were believed to be persistent. If you ignored subtle signs during the day, flickering candles, misplaced objects, strange feelings, the dead upgraded their communication methods at night. Fear was not cruelty. Fear was effectiveness. A spirit trying to reach you didn't whisper, "Excuse me, I have a minor request." It manifested as a heavy weight on your chest, a dream of being grabbed, a shadow looming in the corner of a dream room. A cold hand touching yours, a sudden inability to move, a voice calling your name sharply. Nightmare symptoms that today resemble sleep paralysis were interpreted as ancestor intervention. They needed something done, and they needed it done correctly. Sleep was simply the best way to trap you long enough to explain what the dead wanted. If nightmares came from the dead, the living needed to decode the message. The dead might demand proper burial rites if something had been done incorrectly, food offerings, common in East Asian traditions, prayers, common in Christian households, maintenance of a grave that had been neglected, completion of unfinished duties like settling debts, peace between family members, a frequent theme, protection for living descendants, attention to a wrong that needed righting. Messages didn't arrive gently. They arrived as terror because the line between living and dead was believed to be strongest during nightmares. Strong messages required strong delivery. Nightmares weren't trauma responses. They were to-do lists from the afterlife. Restless spirits made the worst sleepers. Not all spirits were ancestors. Some were restless dead. People who had died violently, tragically, or without closure. These spirits weren't considered malicious, but they weren't considered stable either. A nightmare of being chased, being suffocated, wandering through darkness, falling, standing in a grave, hearing distant cries might indicate a restless spirit trapped between worlds. Their emotions became your nightmare. Their distress pressed into your dream like a cold wind blowing through a door you forgot to close. People interpreted these dreams as a call to action. The living had to perform rituals to ease the spirit's suffering, burn incense, light candles, speak the spirit's name, make offerings, recite prayers, bury or rebury, remains respectfully, resolve a story. The spirit couldn't finish. Restless spirits didn't want to haunt you. They wanted to stop haunting themselves. Dream pressure had a purpose. Feeling weight on your chest, one of the most common nightmare sensations, was often interpreted as a spirit sitting close, trying to speak. The pressure wasn't attack, it was presence. Spirits weren't physical, they were heavy in a psychological, emotional, or spiritual sense. That heaviness translated into sensation. People described it like this. My grandmother leaned close. My father pressed on my shoulders. An unknown ancestor held me still. Someone touched my chest. They wanted me to listen. Nightmares weren't horrifying. They were purposeful. Terrifying, sure, but purposeful. The dead had no social boundaries. Some cultures believed you could get nightmares simply by ignoring your ancestors. If you hadn't visited graves recently, or failed to perform seasonal offerings, or neglected to maintain family traditions, ancestors staged nighttime interventions. They didn't wait politely for your morning routines. They didn't ask if you were well rested. They didn't consider whether you had a busy week coming up. Dead relatives showed up when they felt like it, often delivering emotional messages with the subtlety of a thunderclap. A dream of a relative crying. You disappointed them. A dream of a relative silent and staring. You better fix something immediately. A dream of a relative pulling you somewhere. A warning. Danger near. The afterlife had no office hours. If the dead had thoughts, they shared them. Cultural variations on how the dead communicated across the world. Patterns emerged. In ancient China, ancestors visited dreams to correct family behavior or provide guidance. Nightmares meant you had ignored them too long. In many indigenous cultures, dreams were shared spaces where ancestors protected or warned descendants. A frightening dream meant danger approached. In medieval Europe, dead relatives appeared in nightmares to warn of sin, provide prophetic visions, or request spiritual assistance. In Africa and the Caribbean, ancestral spirits communicated through dreams when balance in the household had been disrupted or duties neglected. Every culture had its own vocabulary for these encounters, but the logic was universal. The dead did not stay silent. Nightmares as family obligations. The emotional weight of these beliefs was enormous. Nightmares weren't merely frightening experiences, they were responsibilities. If you failed to interpret the message correctly, you risked spiritual imbalance or further visitations. Families analysed nightmares like urgent letters. What did she say? What direction did he point? Did the spirit appear whole or broken? What colour was the place? This wasn't imagination. This was communication. And communication required action. The humour behind the haunting. The idea is both touching and terrifying. Even when your relatives died, they still expected you to keep up with chores, rituals, offerings, and emotional management. You thought death ended responsibility. They thought death expanded it. Even in death, family still needed things. Before psychology existed, the dream world wasn't seen as an internal stage where your subconscious shuffled props around. It was seen as a territory, a landscape you owned, recognized, and navigated through the logic of your daily life. So when people dreamed of places they had never been, creatures they had never seen, or symbols they could not name, the conclusion wasn't, "My imagination is creative." It was, "Someone else sent this." A dream with foreign content wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. If something didn't belong to you, it belonged to someone, or something else. Your dream world was a familiar neighborhood. People of earlier eras believed that dreams reflected the dreamer's own environment. Someone in a fishing village dreamed of boats, storms, and coastal spirits. Someone in the mountains dreamed of bears, snow, and ancestral guardians. Someone in a medieval town dreamed of markets, churches, demons, and familiar alleyways. Dreams were shaped by your home, your work, your family, your fears, your daily routines. Nightmares too were expected to feel local. Wolves, witches, storms, shadows, sickness. Even frightening dreams had a sense of geographical logic. So when a dream broke the rules, by showing a desert to someone who lived in a cold region, or sea monsters to someone who had never seen the ocean, or a strange cityscape no villager could recognize, the dreamer felt their mind had been breached. The dream wasn't personal, it was an intrusion. Foreign dreams signaled outside influence. Foreign landscapes in dreams raised an immediate question. Who brought this here? One thing was certain, the dreamer didn't create it. Something external entered their sleeping world and dragged the dreamer into a mental environment that did not belong to them. Early thinkers believed that dreams had a kind of territorial integrity. Your mind had borders. Foreign dreams meant those borders had been crossed. The intruder might be a spirit, a demon, a witch, a wandering dream, being a god, a restless ancestor, a malicious traveller from another realm, or simply a force that enjoyed disorienting humans. Whatever the cause, it wasn't benign. Unfamiliar creatures meant you'd been contacted. Dreaming of animals or beings you had no cultural reference for was especially terrifying. Medieval Europeans, for example, were deeply unsettled by dreams of exotic animals, lions, elephants, strange birds, because they indicated a dream that didn't come from their own life. A villager in the Alps shouldn't dream of camels. A farmer in England shouldn't dream of tigers. A shepherd in Finland shouldn't dream of crocodiles. If they did, something foreign was walking through their dream. People believed unfamiliar animals in dreams could be messengers from distant gods, spirits travelling from other realms, beasts representing foreign curses, illusions planted by witches, omens of misfortune coming from afar, warnings that the dreamer was attracting attention. And because people feared what they couldn't categorize, unfamiliar dream creatures carried deep significance. They were not metaphors, they were visitors, nightmares that took place in strange settings, or even worse. Imagine a medieval villager dreaming of towering stone structures, sunsets the colour of metals they had never seen, landscapes with impossible geometry, vast oceans when they lived inland, deserts when they lived in forests, brilliant lights or strange architecture cities they had never heard of. These dreams weren't interpreted as imagination. They were interpreted as journeys, and journeys you didn't choose. The dreamer wasn't internally creative, they were externally displaced. Something had grabbed their soul or mind during sleep and dragged it somewhere else. The dreamer returned shaken because they believed they had travelled, not imagined. These dreams could mean the dreamer was being summoned, the dreamer had crossed paths with an unknown force, the dreamer was being warned of distant danger. The dreamer was becoming spiritually open, which wasn't good. The dreamer had become visible to entities beyond the local world. Nightmares weren't just emotional, they were geographic, foreign dreams as a form of spiritual contamination. The unfamiliar was considered spiritually hazardous. It wasn't xenophobia in the modern sense, it was metaphysical xenophobia. Foreignness meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant danger. A dream from outside your cultural, geographic, or spiritual domain might bring illness, curses, instability, lost luck, misfortune, weakened soul defenses, or the arrival of something foreign into the waking world. Some cultures kept dream journals not to understand symbolism, but to map intrusion patterns. If villagers began having similar foreign dreams, people believed a force was approaching the community. Travellers were blamed for spreading dream pollution. When outsiders visited a community, the locals often experienced an uptick in strange dreams. This wasn't seen as coincidence. Travellers brought new languages, foods, customs, illnesses, and apparently dream influence as well. Foreigners were thought to carry spirits or energies with them. When they slept nearby, their dreams might drift into neighbouring homes. Children and vulnerable adults were especially susceptible. If someone had a nightmare involving strange imagery shortly after a traveller visited the village, the explanation was simple. His dreams wandered. Yours got caught in them. Dream contamination was a real concept. Centuries before anyone invented the idea of germs, nightmares as warnings from distant powers. Some cultures believed that foreign dreams were intentional messages from distant gods or spiritual forces. These forces didn't speak the dreamer's language, so they communicated through disorienting imagery. A desert dream could warn of drought. A sea dream could warn of a storm that would impact trade. A dream of strange animals could signal the arrival of travelers, invaders, or new diseases. A dream of an unfamiliar city could foretell political change. Foreign dreams weren't dismissed. They were interpreted with urgency. Interpreters specialized in non-local dreams. Because foreign dreams felt alien, interpreters treated them as high-risk cases. A dream full of unfamiliar elements required consultations, rituals, offerings, questions about recent visitors, examinations of local omens, community involvement. These dreams were too big to handle alone. A dreamer who dreamed of foreign places might be isolated for a time, not as punishment, but to ensure nothing followed the dream back. The humour behind the fear. Imagine explaining a nightmare today. I had a dream about sand dunes, and your entire community freezes because you've never seen sand dunes. Someone is interfering. Foreign dreams weren't creativity. They were security breaches. If it felt unfamiliar, it wasn't yours. Before modern psychology taught humanity that dreams come from neural networks firing in the dark like confused lightning, people looked upward for explanations, far upward. Nightmares weren't produced by the mind, because the mind, historically, got blamed for almost nothing and credited for even less. Instead, dreams were shaped by the sky, a sprawling cosmic machine whose gears were planets, whose dials were star patterns, and whose temperament was unpredictable enough to ruin an entire night's sleep. Astrology wasn't just a personality quiz in ancient and medieval societies. It was a total worldview, a celestial operating system believed to govern body, spirit, emotion, behavior, fate, illness, luck, and dreams. Nightmares, then, weren't personal. They were astrological accidents, the cosmic equivalent of tripping on the universe's carpet. Stars had opinions about you. People believed the stars were not passive lights. They were forces, broadcasting invisible rays into the minds of sleepers. If the stars aligned positively, dreams were harmonious and prophetic. If they aligned poorly, dreams turned chaotic, frightening, or downright nightmarish. Astrologers didn't ask dreamers what happened in the dream. They asked, what day was it? What hour? What phase was the moon in? Which planet ruled that hour? Which zodiac sign dominated the sky? Were the stars in good temper or bad? Dream analysis was less psychotherapy and more astronomy homework. If you dreamed of falling, an astrologer might explain, the moon was waning under Capricorn, obviously instability. Dreamed of being chased. Saturn was hostile in the eastern quadrant. Dreamed of burning. Mars was too dominant. Dreamed of drowning. Neptune, well, the ancient equivalent, was meddling again. Nightmares weren't emotional turmoil. They were weather reports created by the sky. Planetary mischief was a known hazard. Astrologers believed each planet influenced dreams differently. Mars, aggression, violence, arguments, fire, pursuit. Saturn, sorrow, dread, heaviness, loss. Venus, temptation, longing, embarrassing romantic content. Mercury, confusion, chaos, trickery, nonsensical dream plots. Jupiter, big dreams, sometimes too big, overwhelming images. The moon, instability, shifting dreamscapes, emotional extremes. The sun, clarity, unless obscured by another planet's influence. If several planets decided to misbehave at once, the sleeper had no chance. A bad planetary night was like 6 unruly co-workers showing up in your subconscious, rearranging your furniture and leaving without cleaning up. When people woke from nightmares, the explanation was simple. A planet had wandered into the wrong mood. Astrological hours turned nights into schedules. Every hour of the night was ruled by a different planet. Ancient dream manuals included tables showing the hour you fell asleep, the hour you entered dream state, the planetary ruler of that hour, the type of dream you could expect. You weren't dreaming spontaneously. You were dreaming on a celestial timetable. If your nightmare occurred during Mars's hour, aggressive dream. Saturn's hour, hopeless dream. Mercury's hour, a dream so confusing you'd wake up angry. Venus's hour, an awkward dream you'd refuse to talk about. Dreamers weren't responsible for their nightmares. The planets clocked in and did the work. Zodiac signs added extra chaos. Not satisfied with planetary meddling, early astrologers also insisted that zodiac signs influenced dream quality. Each sign had reputations: Aries, violent dreams, conflict. Taurus, dreams of weight, heaviness, or paralysis. Gemini, scattered, contradictory, two-part dreams. Cancer, water nightmares, emotional flooding. Leo, dreams of fire, danger, or roaring creatures. Virgo, unsettlingly mundane dreams that felt too real. Libra, dreams of judgment or imbalance. Scorpio, intense nightmares featuring fear or death. Sagittarius, travel nightmares, falling, being lost. Capricorn, dark, heavy, foreboding dreams. Aquarius, bizarre, surreal nightmares. Pisces, dreams that mixed reality and illusion dangerously. Astrology didn't just describe your personality, it described your sleep problems, comets, and eclipses. Where the real terror planets caused regular nightmares, but comets and eclipses caused legendary ones. Comets were believed to carry disease, misfortune, madness, spiritual disruption, cosmic heat that destabilized dreams. Eclipses were worse. They created nightmares considered prophetic, apocalyptic, or deeply unwelcomed. Dreams of the world ending, dreams of loved ones dying, dreams of monsters, dreams of skies falling, dreams of losing one's soul. People woke up after these nights drenched in sweat, convinced that the universe had personally intervened. Nightmares weren't dreams, they were astronomical events happening in your brain. The stars didn't just influence you, They targeted you. In this worldview, the cosmos had a personality, and sometimes that personality was petty. If the heavens were disturbed by war, famine, plague, political unrest, weather shifts, then the stars reacted, and those reactions rained down into human sleep. Nightmares became cosmic commentary. The sky was complaining, and your dreams were where it vented. If society was unstable, nightmares increased. Astrologers explained, the heavens are in disorder. If you personally had nightmares, the astrologer said, a planet is afflicting you. Sleeping correctly required astronomical preparation. People tried to avoid planetary interference with rituals such as going to bed at a safe hour, avoiding sleep during malefic planetary periods, wearing certain metals associated with protective planets, reciting prayers aligned with lunar phases, sleeping with astrological talismans under pillows, positioning the bed according to zodiac direction. A bad dream could be prevented if you understood the night sky as well as astronomers did. Nightmares weren't random. They were misaligned stars leaning over your bed. The humor behind the horror. Imagine waking up today and saying, I had a terrible nightmare, and someone replies, well, Jupiter was grumpy and Mercury spent the night messing with your neurons. It sounds absurd, until you remember that for most of human history, this was the official explanation. Mercury wasn't in retrograde, it was in your bedroom. Before psychology explained nightmares as internal phenomena, and before sleep doctors explained them as neurochemical events, people took a far more hands-on approach. If something frightened you at night, the solution wasn't therapy, it was hardware. Nightmares were external forces, creatures, spirits, demons, witches, ancestors, or cosmic mishaps, so protection had to be external too. Your bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a battlefield perimeter, and around that perimeter you placed your defences, charms, amulets, herbs, stones, carved symbols, iron tools, sacred objects, an entire arsenal of nocturnal protection. The medieval bed didn't look like a place to rest. It looked like a shrine, a small fortress, or the personal workspace of a very paranoid jeweler. Nightmares were treated like physical intruders. People believed that nightmares had form, maybe invisible form, maybe shadowy form, maybe spiritual form, but still form. And if something had form, you could block it with objects. The same way walls kept out thieves, charms kept out spirits. The same way locks kept out enemies, symbols kept out nightmares. Your mind was not the battleground. Your bedroom was. Humans had two states, awake, where you guarded yourself, asleep, where objects guarded you. Nightmares didn't come from within. They broke in. Charm logic, if it worked. Yesterday. It must work forever. Protective objects varied wildly by region and religion, but they followed the same basic principles. Nightmares are external attackers. Protective objects scare or block those attackers. You must place the objects between you and the night. People didn't need the objects to make sense. They needed the objects to work. If a grandmother said placing an iron nail under your pillow prevented nightmares, the entire family did it. If a local healer said 3 sprigs of lavender tied with a red thread protected the dreamer, consider your bed fragrant forever. Iron, the ultimate dream shield. Iron was believed to be the natural enemy of the supernatural. It repelled spirits, witches, demons, malicious dream beings, wandering shadows, anything that moved unnaturally in the night. You could find iron under pillows tied to bedposts worn around the neck, hung on the wall, hidden in mattress stuffing shaped into rings, nails, knives, scissors, keys. Special note: scissors left open under the bed were considered a nightmare deterrent. Did they repel demons? Or did demons simply not want to risk walking into open blades? Either way, effective. Herbs, plants, and sleep smells. Nature was believed to offer potent dream protection. Herbs weren't calming, they were nightmare repellents. Common anti-nightmare herbs included lavender, soothing, protective; rosemary, repelled spirits; rue, blocked witchcraft; sage, cleansing; mint, calming, clarifying; chamomile, disarmed evil influences; St. Brere's, D. John's wort, sun-aligned herb, good against dark forces. People sewed herb bundles into pillows, hung them above beds, or burned them before sleep. To modern noses, it might smell like a rustic apothecary. To the medieval sleeper, it smelled like safety. Nightmares weren't emotional reactions. They were invaders, and herbs were the border patrol. Symbols, the original password protection. Symbols were the spiritual equivalent of encryption. They didn't just protect, they confused, redirected, or locked out approaching forces. Common protective symbols included crosses, universal demon deterrents in Christian regions; stars and triangles, geometric barriers; eyes, to watch for danger while you slept; runes carved into bed frames; pentacles, protective, not sinister; knotted cords, tangled spirits couldn't navigate knots; spirals, trapdoors for nightmares, seriously. If nightmares were like thieves, symbols were like beware of dog signs, except the dog was cosmic geometry. Religious objects, the highest level dream armor religion, offered the most powerful tools. People believed holy items didn't just block nightmares, they vaporized them. These included rosaries under pillows, saint medallions sewn into clothing, holy water sprinkled on bedding, scripture pages tucked into headboards, tiny icons hung near the bed, amulets inscribed with prayers, blessed candles left burning until they extinguished themselves. If the supernatural attacked at night, humans responded with spiritual weaponry. A demon approaching a bed with religious objects might as well have approached an armed fortress. Household objects with accidental powers. Some protective objects weren't spiritual, they were just convenient. These included shoes placed facing the door, nightmares tripped trying to enter; brooms laid across thresholds, spirits had to count every straw; mirrors, trapped spirits in reflections; bowls of water, spirits got distracted looking into them; open books, confused wandering forces because reading is hard. Nightmares weren't philosophical. They were easily distracted, dream catchers and web-like objects. Many indigenous cultures used objects designed specifically to filter dreams. Though varying by region and tradition, the core idea was the same. Good dreams passed through. Bad dreams got stuck. Morning light eliminated the trapped nightmares. These weren't metaphors, they were technologies. Structures of woven patterns mimicked cosmic order. Anything chaotic, like nightmares, became ensnared. You didn't interpret nightmares. You trapped them until sunrise. The bed is a sacred zone. Because nightmares attacked sleepers, many cultures treated the bed as sacred space. People purified the bed through rituals, smudging with smoke, sprinkling salt, circling the mattress with protective herbs, reciting chants, tapping bedposts, blessing each corner. The goal was simple: create a protective dome around the sleeping person. Nightmares could roam, but they should not cross the line. Nightmare prevention was a whole lifestyle. Protection didn't stop at objects. People had behavioral rules. Don't sleep with hair unbraided, spirits get tangled. Don't sleep with feet pointed toward doors, invites beings. Don't sleep on your back, tempts spirits to sit on you. Don't fall asleep while arguing, gives nightmares fuel. Nightmares weren't spontaneous. They were opportunities for the supernatural, unless you blocked them with your carefully curated bedtime armor. The humor behind it. All, imagine lying in bed surrounded by iron nails, 4 herbs, 3 symbols, a bowl of water, a broom, a cross, a charm sewn into your nightshirt, and thinking, yes, now the nightmares won't dare. It seems excessive, but to people of the past it was better than facing dream terrors unprotected. spiritual antivirus hung over the bed. Throughout most of human history, sleep wasn't considered a quiet retreat from the world. It was considered a temporary disappearance, a voluntary surrender of consciousness that left your body exposed, your soul wandering, and your survival entirely dependent on luck and whatever supernatural neighborhood you happened to exist in. Sleeping wasn't a break. Sleeping was an act of courage. It was the only daily activity where you willingly shut down every survival instinct and hoped nothing noticed. The vulnerability problem. Without modern locks, stable houses, or trustworthy medicine, sleep was risky simply because you couldn't defend yourself. You could be attacked by wild animals, thieves, enemies, disease, spirits, witches, demons, ancestors with unresolved emotional issues, your own livestock. People didn't assume they'd wake up safely. They hoped they would. If you fell asleep peacefully, you were considered blessed. If you woke up in the morning, you had survived another round. Rest was not a right. Rest was a gamble. The soul-wandering theory. One of the most widespread explanations for sleep was the belief that the soul left the body during slumber. Dreams weren't internal hallucinations. They were the soul's travel experiences. During sleep, your life force drifted outside your body, wandered through unseen realms, and only reluctantly returned before waking. This meant that sleeping wasn't simply lying down to rest. It was sending your soul on a trip without supervision. And the worst part? You were unconscious while it happened. If the soul got delayed, distracted, or blocked by wandering spirits, you might die, or wake up groggy, confused, or emotionally shattered. Nightmares were seen as collisions between your soul and things it met while roaming. This made sleep inherently perilous. If your soul went too far, or into the wrong neighborhood, or near something hungry, that was on you for choosing to nap. Sleep made the body helpless. When your soul stepped out for its nightly stroll, your body was believed to go limp, fully vulnerable to supernatural interference. Anyone or anything could. Sit on your chest, rearrange your limbs, drain your energy, whisper into your mind, steal your breath, mark your skin, tie invisible knots around your spirit. People didn't consider paralysis a medical phenomenon. They considered it evidence that something was using your body while you were out. Imagine leaving your house unlocked every night because you temporarily moved somewhere else. That's how people imagined sleep. Night was an active time for the unseen. In previous chapters, we've seen how night was believed to be a separate landscape. Darkness wasn't passive, it was crowded. Spirits emerged, demons worked night shifts, witches rode people, the dead delivered messages, and cosmic forces shoved their influence into dreams. Humans were the only creatures asleep. Everything else was awake and curious. You weren't resting. You were stepping aside so the night could do its thing. Falling asleep required precautions. Sleeping safely meant preparing like someone preparing for a voyage or war. People made sure to pray before bed, avoid sleeping in dangerous directions, keep weapons close. For humans or demons, your choice. Place protective objects around the bed, keep bedding tightly tucked to seal. The body? Never sleep with feet facing a door. Never sleep near mirrors, which doubled as portals. Never sleep near open windows, air-carried spirits. Never fall asleep angry or sad. Your soul might wander to dark places. Everyone had rituals. Everyone had rules. You didn't fall asleep casually, unless you were reckless or incredibly brave. Sleeping alone was dangerous. Too much solitude in sleep was seen as vulnerability. People preferred to sleep near others not for warmth or bonding, but for spiritual defense. Sleeping in groups meant shared warmth, more eyes listening for danger, collective spiritual protection, fewer opportunities for being singled out, reduced risk of being ridden, pressed, or visited. Children especially were rarely allowed to sleep alone. A solitary sleeper was an obvious target, easy for supernatural forces to approach. If you slept alone and had nightmares, nobody wondered why. They wondered why you'd been foolish enough to sleep without witnesses. Sleep was also a gateway for illness. Early medical theories believed sleep opened the body to disease. A resting body was inactive, which supposedly made it easier for mists, vapors, bad air, night winds, imbalanced humours, roaming illnesses to enter and attack the system. Cover your mouth at night. Keep your limbs tucked. Don't sleep with your head toward open doors or windows. Never sleep after eating moist foods. People genuinely believed illnesses crept into sleepers like burglars. A nightmare wasn't just a spiritual event. It could be the first symptom of sickness having entered. Dreams reflected the risks. Nightmares were considered the natural consequence of a hazardous activity. Of course you dreamed of danger. You were in danger. Of course you dreamed of falling. Your soul wandered. Of course you dreamed of being chased. The night was full of things that hunted wandering souls. A smooth, peaceful dream. That meant nothing interfered. A nightmare. Something definitely noticed you. Nightmares weren't considered strange. Not having nightmares was. People who slept too easily were suspect. Someone who slept too deeply or too comfortably was either spiritually ignorant, protected by a mysterious force, or under the influence of something unnatural. Light sleepers were respected. Heavy sleepers were mistrusted. Those who slept through storms, noises, or danger were considered unrealistic at best, cursed at worst. Sleep wasn't a simple biological need. It was a battleground, a crossroads, a hazard zone. Resting wasn't relaxing. It was brave. Before psychology existed, curiosity was not considered a harmless personality trait. It was considered a behavior with spiritual side effects. Asking too many questions, wondering about forbidden subjects, poking mentally into mysteries better left alone. These weren't quirks. They were risks. And when those risks blossomed into nightmares, people didn't analyze their thoughts. They said, well, you shouldn't have thought about that. Nightmares weren't internal reflections. They were punishments for intellectual trespassing. In a world where knowledge was controlled, secrecy was powerful, and unexplained forces lurked behind every tree. Curiosity wasn't problem-solving. Curiosity was inviting something to notice you. Thinking too much was a dangerous activity. People believed thoughts weren't confined to the mind. Thoughts travelled. Thoughts echoed. Thoughts stirred forces. A curious mind wasn't admired. It was suspicious. What if your thoughts wandered into forbidden realms? What if your questions brushed against hidden things? What if pondering a mystery caused the mystery to ponder you back? Nightmares were blamed not on fear, but on thinking. Too deeply, too boldly, too abstractly, too irreverently, too frequently, too late at night. A big no-no. Your imagination wasn't creative. It was disobedient. Forbidden subjects. Invited nighttime consequences. People were warned to avoid thinking about spirits, the dead witches, demons, cosmic forces, divination, forbidden rituals, the nature of the soul, the boundaries of the afterlife, anything involving the unseen. If you thought too long about spirits, you might dream of spirits. If you questioned divine mysteries, you might dream of divine punishment. If you mused about the nature of evil might visit your dreams to clarify your confusion. Dreaming was not an internal process. It was like opening your front door and yelling, "Is anyone out there?" Unfortunately, someone usually answered. Curiosity was treated like a summoning ritual. In many societies, thoughts themselves were believed to generate spiritual attention. Children were especially warned. Don't think about monsters before bed. Don't imagine strange creatures. Don't dwell on troubling stories. Don't ask questions about the dead. Don't repeat tales of witchcraft. Adults received the same warnings, just with more social pressure. A curious person was someone who might accidentally invite something dangerous into the household. Curiosity wasn't cute. Curiosity was chaotic, and chaos had nighttime consequences. Nightmares as intellectual discipline. Many cultures weaponize nightmares as cautionary tales. If you think about the wrong things, you will dream about them. If you ask too many questions, the night will answer. If you wonder about forbidden subjects, something will show you why they were forbidden. A nightmare wasn't a fear response. It was a celestial slap on the wrist. The mind needed boundaries. Intellectual exploration was treated like trespassing on a nobleman's land, punishable, frightening, and very quickly noticed. Scholars and curious people were high-risk dreamers. People who studied too intensely or read too much were believed to attract nighttime danger. Medieval scholars often confessed to having disturbing dreams, not because they were analysing complex ideas, but because they were believed to be meddling in realms that didn't appreciate meddling. Books contained power. Knowledge had weight. Ideas had teeth. And dreams were where those teeth bit back. Nightmares were seen as the scholar's occupational hazard, the cosmic equivalent of carpal tunnel. The mind as a beacon. Curiosity lit up the mind like a lantern in the dark, and in a world filled with unseen things, a lantern was an invitation. People believed that. Spirits gathered where thoughts wandered. Demons noticed, intellectual, overreaching witches sensed when someone thought about them. Ancestral spirits responded when their names were pondered. Holy beings intervened if someone questioned sacred truths. Your thoughts broadcast your presence. Your curiosity acted like a lighthouse, drawing ships you didn't want to meet. Nightmares were proof that something saw the light. Overthinking was interpreted as spiritual agitation. In the absence of psychology, rumination wasn't internal anxiety. It was considered spiritual turbulence. If you lay awake thinking too much, elders warned, your spirit is restless. Your mind is too open. You're attracting trouble with your thoughts. And if a nightmare followed, this confirmed that the mind had indeed wandered somewhere unsafe. Today we say, overthinking kept me up. Historically, the phrase would have been, overthinking got something's attention. Questioning authority invited supernatural correction. Questioning religious ideas, challenging social norms, or doubting community wisdom often resulted in frightening dreams. These weren't considered coincidences. They were corrective measures from powers that disapproved. Nightmares made excellent enforcers. They frightened the curious back into obedience. If someone publicly questioned a taboo and later had nightmares, people didn't think, guilt. They thought, justice. The dream world policed curiosity with impressive efficiency. Intellectual modesty was a survival strategy. In many cultures, humility was encouraged not just morally, but existentially. An overly curious person was someone likely to attract spiritual backlash. Proper thought behavior included not imagining unknown creatures, not speculating about the afterlife, not mentally questioning sacred narratives, not constructing elaborate fantasies, not picturing supernatural beings, not wondering how magic worked. If you asked the wrong questions, the night would answer, and those answers were rarely pleasant. Nightmares became warnings, not feelings. Fear in dreams wasn't emotional, it was instructional. Nightmares weren't your subconscious screaming. They were the universe saying, stop that. If you dreamed of falling, it meant your thoughts had drifted too far. If you dreamed of being watched, it meant you had wondered about something that noticed you back. If you dreamed of dark figures, it meant you had mentally trespassed into forbidden territory. Nightmares weren't symptoms, they were warnings. Think less, sleep more, or else. And the humour behind it. All imagine being told that the reason you dreamed of a giant creature chasing you wasn't because you were stressed, but because earlier that day you briefly wondered, what is in the forest at night? That single thought turned into a supernatural customer service ticket, and your dream delivered the response. Overthinking, but with consequences. Before psychology existed, nightmares weren't private. They weren't internal, and they definitely weren't individual. In many societies, bad dreams didn't stay with the dreamer. They spilled outward, like smoke drifting from one house to the next. Fear wasn't personal. Fear was contagious. Communities believed nightmares were capable of travelling, settling, multiplying, and infecting households. A village didn't ask, "Why did you dream badly?" They asked, "Why are we dreaming badly?" And whenever entire neighbourhoods began reporting similar nighttime terrors, no one assumed coincidence. They understood it as a collective event, a sign that something was stalking not a person, but a community. Nightmares were never just dreams. They were symptoms of something larger. Nightmares spread like weather. People thought that nightmares, like storms or droughts, arrived in waves. A single dreamer experiencing a terrifying dream was unfortunate. But if several villagers reported nightmares within the same week, it meant the air itself had thickened with fear. Similar nightmares were interpreted as warnings, omens, spiritual contamination, the approach of illness, the lingering echo of recent trauma, the result of cosmic imbalance, a sign that a malevolent force was drifting through the community. Nightmares were atmospheric. A whole community could feel them coming. The plague turned dreams into harbingers. During epidemics, especially events like the Black Death, nightmares were understood as early signals of disaster. People didn't know bacteria existed, but they knew terror spread before bodies fell. Communities reported dreams of suffocation, dreams of walls closing in, dreams of dark figures, dreams of overwhelming heat or choking air, dreams of dead relatives calling from doorways, dreams of ash falling from the sky. These dreams didn't belong to individuals. They belonged to the crisis itself. Nightmares were considered the first strike of a plague spirit, an invisible visitor travelling through homes, announcing its presence before physical symptoms appeared. If a whole town dreamed badly, people prepared for death. War and violence created nighttime echoes. During wars, collective nightmares intensified. Even those who never saw battle dreamed of charging soldiers, burning fields, swords dripping with shadow, collapsing buildings, endless running faceless enemies. Communities believed nightmares were the emotional smoke rising from distant conflicts. Fear seeped into sleeping minds just as fires seep through forests. If one village was attacked, neighbouring communities experienced nightmares. People thought fear itself moved with armies, not just in daylight, but at night, through dreams. Nightmares weren't isolated. They were warfare's silent scouts. Famine created shared dreamscapes. When food ran out, people didn't just become hungry, they became dream-hungry. Communities hit by famine reported eerily similar nightmares, roaming through empty fields, digging for non-existent roots, tables filled with ashes, animals refusing to be caught, water turning to dust in cupped hands, deep wells that led nowhere. These nightmares weren't symbolic. They were believed to be messages from the land itself, a desperate cry for nourishment, or a warning that something had gone deeply wrong in the balance between humans and the natural world. Shared nightmares meant shared guilt or shared danger. Nightmares could be caught. People described nightmares as if they were infections. They believed dreams jumped from house to house between family members, among sleeping companions, across entire neighbourhoods, through communal fear. Sleeping next to someone who recently had a nightmare was considered risky. You might catch the terror the same way you'd catch a cold. If a child in a family had nightmares, adults checked themselves the next morning. If a mother had nightmares, the father kept his distance during sleep. If a neighbour had nightmares, doors were bolted and fires kept burning longer. Fear was seen as psychic smoke, and nightmares were the inhalation. Shared nightmares. During witch scares. In communities terrified of witchcraft, collective nightmares became evidence. People believed witches projected their influence at night, spreading panic through dreams. If multiple villagers dreamed of dark figures, strange animals, women with unnatural eyes, suffocation paralysis, flying shadows, they looked for a witch. Not one witch, the witch responsible for the psychic disturbance. Nightmares didn't just signal witchcraft. Nightmares proved witchcraft. If the entire village dreamed badly for 3 nights in a row, panic became policy. The psychic weather model. Many folk traditions believed dreams reflected the health of a community's spiritual climate. Nightmares indicated wandering spirits, weakened protective forces, angry ancestors, cosmic misalignment, moral decay, collective guilt, the presence of a curse, the need for purification rituals. People cleansed not just houses but entire villages, with bonfires, bell-ringing, mass prayers, chanting incense, burning communal feasts, symbolic offerings, washing rituals. These weren't symbolic acts. They were considered necessary to reset the community's dreamscape. When leaders had nightmares, everyone panicked. A king, chieftain, or elder having a nightmare was a national or tribal emergency. Their dreams were believed to reflect the fate of the entire people. If a leader dreamed of broken crowns, collapsing buildings, bloodstorms, monstrous creatures, deathfire shadows, interpretations flew. Scholars, priests, dream readers, and elders were summoned. Nightmares from leaders echoed downward, binding the community in shared fear. Their dreams weren't personal, they were political. Nightmares created bonding, the dark version. Strangely, collective nightmares also created unity. If everyone was afraid together, people felt connected, validated, aware of shared danger, responsible for communal safety. Nightmares became a shared language, a way of saying, yes, the world is frightening, and we feel it together. Communal fear wasn't weakness, it was cohesion. The night didn't belong to you. In modern times, people ask, why did I dream that? But historically the question was, why are we dreaming this? The dream world didn't belong to individuals, it belonged to the community. Nightmares weren't personal anxieties, they were collective weather patterns, storms passing through sleeping minds, leaving everyone shaken. Anxiety, but make it communal. Before psychology existed, before therapists asked, and how did that make you feel? And before anyone believed the mind had layers deeper than a puddle, fear was not something you unpacked. Fear was something you dodged. Trauma, sorrow, shock, grief, anxiety. These were not inner wounds requiring introspection. They were external blows requiring avoidance. And nightmares, with their vivid terror, were not invitations to reflect. They were alarms, warnings, alerts. You didn't interpret trauma, you survived it. And then you pretended nothing happened so you could get through the next day. Nightmares were treated as visitors, not feelings. Earlier chapters have shown that nightmares were believed to come from demons, witches, animals, spirits, ancestors, cosmic forces, wandering dreams, bad food, the moon. Notice who is not on this list. The dreamer. The dreamer was never the source. The dreamer was the victim. If you had a traumatic dream, nobody asked, what memory might this represent? They asked, what got to you? Or worse, what did you do to attract it? Trauma in dreams wasn't internal reprocessing. It was external invasion. The mind wasn't a landscape, it was a door. To pre-modern thinkers, the mind was not a complex structure filled with memory, emotion, and subconscious material. It was a simple doorway between the physical world and the unseen. When nightmares struck, the explanation was never psychological. It was architectural. Something used the door. You didn't ask why. You asked how to block it next time. Fear wasn't analysed. Fear was barricaded. Trauma was context, not psychology. If someone had survived war, famine, plague, or loss, and later dreamed horrific images, people didn't connect the two. Trauma as a concept didn't exist. Someone who had watched their village burn might dream of fire, but the explanation was, a fire spirit visited you. Someone who had lost children might dream of crying, and the interpretation was, the dead are calling. Someone who survived violence might dream of being chased. This wasn't seen as memory, It was seen as night terrors, sent by spirits or demons, attracted to weakness. Trauma was not something the mind processed internally. It was something the world exploited externally. Fear wasn't explored, it was actioned. When trauma-fueled nightmares appeared, people did not sit quietly and reflect. They reacted. The correct response to a nightmare was to light a candle, burn incense, say a prayer, call a healer, wash the face, cleanse the home, speak to the ancestors, avoid certain foods, sleep in a different position, place protective objects around the bed, perform rituals, blame someone, but never, ever, let me understand the emotional meaning. Nightmares were problems, not puzzles. Emotional pain was a practical matter. Trauma was interpreted physically or spiritually. If you cried at night, it was a cold humor rising. If you felt panic, it was the spirit shaken. If you woke sweating, it was too much heat in the blood. If you trembled, it was a sign of visitation. People addressed emotional distress with herbal remedies, warm drinks, protective symbols, exorcisms, community rituals, prayers, confessions, moral lectures. Fear was treated with tools, not conversation. There was no concept of the subconscious. One of the main reasons trauma nightmares weren't interpreted is simple. People did not believe humans had inner emotional landscapes requiring exploration. Feelings were not buried. Feelings were immediate. If you felt sadness, it was sorrow. If you felt anger, it was anger. If you felt fear, it was fear. There was no concept of a hidden layer below daily awareness. The idea that dreams might encode buried emotions would have sounded like nonsense, like suggesting shadows had motivations or that the wind could feel jealous. Trauma didn't sink into the psyche. It simply lingered in the air. Nightmares were not yours, so why interpret them? Dreams were not considered personal property. They belonged to whatever sent them. You couldn't interpret a nightmare any more than you could interpret a knock on the door without opening it. And opening it was dangerous. People believed that analysing nightmares attracted more nightmares. Thinking about fear invited fear. Reflecting on disturbing images encouraged them to return. Dwelling on trauma created spiritual vulnerability. Interpretation wasn't self-awareness. Interpretation was an invitation. Better to ignore it. Better to pretend nothing happened. Better to move on. Survival required emotional amnesia. In societies with constant danger, high mortality, frequent loss, unpredictable illness, physical hardship, emotional introspection would have been exhausting. Disasters demanded action, not analysis. If you had a traumatic dream after surviving plague, you didn't ask, "How does this reflect my emotional state?" You asked, "How do I keep it from happening again?" And everyone around you agreed. The cultural rule was, be afraid, respond immediately, stop thinking about it. Nightmares were spikes of terror, not pathways to meaning. Fear was a normal part of daily life. Because trauma was everywhere, fear was everywhere. People didn't ask, "Why am I afraid?" They asked, "How do I avoid making it worse?" Nightmares represented disturbances in the world, not in the mind. And disturbances in the world needed fixing, pacifying or expelling, not interpreting. Your emotional pain wasn't hidden, it wasn't symbolic, it wasn't a riddle, it was simply something unfortunate the night did to you. And once morning came, you ignored it. Because ignoring fear was easier than inviting it to stay. The humour behind it. All imagine waking from a nightmare shaking, sweating and terrified, only for the village's response to be, "Well, don't think about it too much." Feelings were not explored. Feelings were not unpacked. Feelings were ignored until morning, and then ignored again until the next nightmare. For centuries, nightmares were treated as spiritual break-ins, midnight assaults from demons, witches, restless spirits, wandering ancestors, cosmic misalignments, and overly curious goats. Everyone knew nightmares came from out there. The body was just the battleground. But eventually, slowly and with great resistance, cracks began forming in this supernatural worldview. These cracks came from an unlikely place. People who started paying attention to the body itself. Anatomists, physicians, early scientists. People who rolled up their sleeves, picked up their knives and said, "What if?" And hear me out. Something inside us is doing the scaring. This was the radical idea. Nightmares might not be cosmic invasions. They might be bodily reactions. This was the intellectual equivalent of telling villagers that fire might be hot for natural reasons, not because a salamander spirit lived inside it. The body gets its very own spotlight. Medieval and early Renaissance medicine began shifting its attention to the physical body. Not dramatically, no one was ready to give up demons entirely, but enough to make people uncomfortable. Physicians, philosophers, and herbalists began asking questions. Why did nightmares happen after heavy meals? Why did exhausted people have more disturbing dreams? Why did fevers produce bizarre dream imagery? Why did certain illnesses predictably bring nightmares? Why did frightened people dream violently even in safe environments? It was shocking to consider that nightmares might be symptoms, not supernatural messages. The body, long ignored as a dream maker, suddenly seemed suspicious. The monster might not be a demon. It might be digestion. Dissection. The forbidden shortcut to answers. One of the biggest cracks in supernatural explanations came from anatomy. As dissection slowly became more acceptable, very slowly, and often illegally, anatomists began discovering nerves, organs, blood vessels, the brain's unusual texture, the vast network connecting body to mind. This was game-changing. If the brain existed, a relatively new revelation for many, and it connected to sensory organs. Maybe dreams came from the body processing information. Some early thinkers proposed a theory so bold it threatened centuries of belief. Nightmares might come from the brain malfunctioning during sleep. This was mildly blasphemous, but also strangely convincing. People didn't immediately abandon demons, but they began admitting demons might occasionally share their workspace with organs. The heart and stomach become suspects. Long before anyone understood REM cycles, early physicians speculated that nightmares might be caused by internal disturbances, indigestion, making the stomach overheat, blood rising toward the head, pressing on the soul, the heart panicking, causing terror in sleep fumes because everything was blamed on fumes-blocked breath, causing suffocation dreams, imbalanced humours, messing with thoughts. These explanations weren't accurate, but they were revolutionary because they relocated nightmares from the sky and the spirit world into the torso. Instead of saying, "a demon pressed on my chest," people began saying, "bad vapours pressed on my chest." It was progress, gross progress, but progress. Sleep itself gains. Medical attention. Doctors began noticing patterns. Soldiers dream violently after battles. Mothers dream anxiously when caring for infants. The sick dream more vividly. The grieving dream of what they lost. The hungry dream desperately. The exhausted dream chaotically. These observations risked a scandalous conclusion. Nightmares reflect life. No spirits required. No curses needed. The body and mind simply reacted to circumstances. This wasn't yet psychology, but it was the earliest rumbling in that direction. The brain graduates from decoration to organ. Ancient anatomists, especially Egyptians, largely ignored the brain, assuming it was cooling jelly. But later scholars, Hippocrates, Galen, and beyond, began treating the brain as something important. If the brain controlled sensation, maybe it also controlled dreams. If the brain interpreted the world while awake, maybe it interpreted memories while asleep. If the brain was stressed, wounded, overheated, or exhausted, maybe nightmares were the brain's version of a fever. This was radical. Saying dreams came from the brain was like saying rain came from the sky instead of angry cloud spirits. Scientifically correct, but deeply upsetting to traditionalists. Disease patterns, exposed nightmares as symptoms. Plague, physicians, battlefield doctors, travelling healers, they all noticed nightmares clustered around illness. Fevers, infections, malnutrition, dehydration, respiratory distress. If nightmares accompanied sickness, then nightmares might be physiological, not external attacks. A fever burning through the bloodstream created vivid dreams, hallucinations, terror, visions, disorientation. What people once attributed to spirits was increasingly tied to symptoms. The monster wasn't a demon. The monster was the disease. Turns out the monster had a pulse. Philosophers take an interest. Philosophers like Aristotle offered early naturalistic explanations for dreams. Dreams arise from sensory impressions left over from the day. Strong emotions create stronger dreams. The sleeping body influences the content of sleep. Nightmares reflect imbalance, not invasion. These ideas weren't yet trauma psychology, but they cracked the door open. They dared to suggest that dreams came from within the dreamer, not from outside forces. This shift scared people far more than demons ever did. Resistance. The supernatural wasn't ready to leave. Even with medical progress, most people didn't abandon older explanations. Why? Demons were easier to blame than digestion. Witches made better villains than nerves. Spirits were familiar. The moon had seniority. And the idea of personal responsibility for nightmares was deeply uncomfortable. Still, the cracks grew. Slowly, explanations expanded. Nightmares, body, plus spirit, plus stars, plus dinner, plus emotions, plus illness. This jumble wasn't scientific, but it was evolving. The great shift from external to internal. By the Renaissance, enough thinkers had studied anatomy, sleep behaviours, and physiological responses that the supernatural monopoly started collapsing. Nightmares were no longer guaranteed demon visits. They could be indigestion, stress, illness, loss, exhaustion, fear, grief. Human beings were terrifyingly complex. For the first time, scholars began suspecting nightmares were natural consequences, not supernatural punishments. The monster wasn't out there, it was the mind itself. And that realization, quiet, gradual, and deeply unsettling, led humanity toward the modern understanding that nightmares aren't invaders. They're reflections. But at the time, they were just relieved to learn the monster had a pulse. A quiet reflection on how fear moved from the dark to the mind. After centuries of blaming demons, witches, ancestors, livestock, dinner, the moon, curious thoughts, and Mercury barging into the bedroom uninvited, humanity finally turned inward and discovered a startling truth. The nightmare wasn't stalking you from outside, it was generated from within. This revelation was both comforting and horrifying, equal parts relief and disappointment. On one hand, no supernatural creature was sitting on your chest. On the other, your own brain was perfectly capable of creating horrors more vivid than anything lurking outside your window. Nightmares had moved, not out of existence, just from the shadows into the skull. Fear relocated, but it didn't retire. When people first learned nightmares came from the mind, not spirits, they didn't celebrate. They recoiled. If nightmares were self-made, then fear wasn't an invader. Fear was a resident, a permanent tenant, the spooky neighbour who lived inside your head and didn't pay rent. This raised uncomfortable questions humanity had never asked before. What if the mind could frighten itself? What if dreams were emotional echoes rather than supernatural warnings? What if the darkness we feared wasn't outside the room, but inside the brain? What if the scariest visitor at night was memory, or loss, or grief, or the things we refused to acknowledge during the day? Nightmares didn't vanish when demons left the stage. They simply revealed their new puppeteer. The brain turns out to be a surprisingly dramatic artist. Once scientists began studying brain activity, they discovered something astonishing. The brain wasn't passive during sleep. It wasn't resting. It wasn't turned off. It was improvising. In fact, the sleeping brain was sorting emotions, replaying memories, testing danger responses, discarding information, reorganizing thoughts, generating random imagery, stitching fragments into narratives, amplifying unprocessed fears. Nightmares weren't supernatural messages. They were the mind's way of filing paperwork so chaotically that entire scenes burst into flames. We had spent centuries blaming spirits. All along, fear was just the nervous system trying to get its job done. The good news, you're not being attacked. By the time psychology matured, humanity learned an important truth. Nightmares don't come from dark, malicious forces. They come from anxiety, grief trauma, unresolved thoughts, stress, internal conflicts, misfiring neurons, the brain reorganizing itself, the ancient survival instinct rehearsing worst-case scenarios. In other words, nightmares aren't invasions, they're rehearsals. Your mind practices fear the way your body practices balance. Nightmares let you test danger without encountering it. Fear, ironically, is protective. The good news is you're safer than people once believed. You're not being hunted. You're not being ridden, pressed, visited, observed, or cursed. Your mind is just doing maintenance, poorly and dramatically, but maintenance nonetheless. The bad news, the brain takes creative liberties. Here's the twist. Your brain, unshackled from external blame, remains an unpredictable storyteller. It combines emotions with memories, adds a dash of nonsense, sprinkles in your deepest fears, and bakes it into a nightmare casserole you never asked for. You don't need demons. You have imagination. You don't need a witch sitting on you. You have muscle paralysis. You don't need the moon manipulating your dreams. You have stress. You don't need cursed goats wandering too close. You have an overactive amygdala. The supernatural world retired. The brain picked up the night shift without missing a beat. Nightmares became mirrors instead of monsters. As psychology grew, nightmares transformed from external threats into internal reflections. People began to understand a dream of being chased reflects fear of stress or pressure. A dream of falling reflects insecurity or instability. A dream of suffocation reflects anxiety or trauma. A dream of losing someone reflects attachment and fear of loss. A dream of monsters reflects emotional overwhelm, not literal danger. The old question, who is doing this to me, became, why is my mind choosing this story tonight? This introspection frightened people more than demons ever did, because monsters can be fought. But emotions, those required acknowledgement, and early humans had centuries of experience avoiding that. The night no longer belonged to spirits, it belonged to you. When supernatural explanations faded, the night didn't get safer, it got quieter. The shadows didn't change, but the interpretation did. Instead of wandering spirits, the nighttime landscape held memories that resurfaced, thoughts pushed down too long, fears that needed space, grief that needed processing, unresolved conflicts, unspoken truths, the mind rearranging itself in the dark. Nightmares weren't something visiting you from the outside. Nightmares were something rising up from within. Fear moved homes. It didn't disappear. The modern paradox. We no longer blame the night for our nightmares. We blame ourselves, which is, in its own way, worse. The old explanations were frightening but external. That witch is tormenting me. The new explanations are intimate. My mind is tormenting itself. The old worldview said, you're being attacked. The new worldview says, you're remembering. But this shift, quiet, gradual, and often unnoticed, represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual leaps. For the first time, we accepted that our inner world can be as frightening as the outer one. The final reflection. Humanity moved from darkness filled with monsters to minds filled with meaning. From sleeping in fear of night creatures to sleeping with fear of ourselves. from blaming forces beyond our control to studying forces within our biology. And in the end, the story becomes beautifully simple. Nightmares were never trying to kill you. They were trying to communicate. The good news? You're no longer fighting demons. The bad news? You're negotiating with your own brain. And your brain has a flair for dramatic storytelling. Fear has simply changed addresses. It moved from the shadows to the self, and it plans to stay.